Now, standing at the edge of his inherited land with dust settling on his boots and a lawyer's letter crumpled in his fist, he could see smoke rising from the neighboring property. Her property. Clara Bennett. The name alone still cut deeper than any knife he'd carried across 3 territories. She was supposed to be gone, married, safe from the choice he'd made. But the lawyer's words echoed, "The widow lives adjacent to your father's eastern boundary." Widow. The word changed everything. Welcome, friends, to a story of second chances and buried secrets on the American frontier. If you stay with me until the end, you'll discover whether love can survive pride, loss, and the weight of family sins. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The train's whistle cut through the Montana afternoon like a mourner's cry, and Ethan Cole stepped onto the platform of a town that no longer recognized him. 6 years could reshape a man. It could carve lines into his face, turn his hands to leather, and teach him that some distances couldn't be measured in miles. Ethan had learned all of this in the territories, riding herd through Colorado winters, breaking horses in Wyoming dust, sleeping under stars that offered no answers to the questions that haunted him. He'd left Pine Ridge as a boy of 22, angry and convinced that leaving was the only honorable choice left to him. He'd returned as something else entirely. The platform bustled with activity that would have seemed impossible in 1870. Electric lights flickered in shop windows. A telegraph office stood where McGreevy's stable had been. Women walked past in fashionable Eastern dresses, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the rhythmic clang of construction, the town expanding, modernizing, forgetting. But some things, Ethan knew, never changed. "Mr. Cole." A thin man in a dark suit approached, extending a pale hand. "Thomas Wickham. I'm the attorney handling your father's estate. My condolences on your loss." Ethan shook the offered hand, noting its softness, a hand that had never swung an axe or mended a fence in its life. "Mr. Wickham, your telegram was brief." "Yes, well." Wickham adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Some matters are best discussed in person. I have a carriage waiting. The ride to the ranch will give us time to review the particulars of the will." The carriage rolled through streets Ethan half remembered, past buildings that wore their newness like ill-fitting clothes. He watched it all through the window, his jaw tight, his hands resting on his knees in a stillness that had become habitual. A cowboy learned to conserve movement, to exist in the spaces between action. It was a survival skill. "Your father's holdings are substantial," Wickham said, pulling documents from his leather case. "Nearly 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, water rights to Miller's Creek, the main house, and 3 outbuildings. The cattle operation has been maintained by the foreman, Jack Murphy. I believe you know him?" "I know Jack." Ethan's voice was rough from disuse. He hadn't spoken much on the train, hadn't spoken much in years if he was being honest. "Good, good. Now, there are a few complications we should discuss." Wickham shuffled papers with the focused nervousness of a man about to deliver bad news. "Your father made several significant changes to the property in the years before his death. Sold off the southern parcel, actually, in 1873. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Sold it? That was the best grazing land." "Yes, well." Wickham cleared his throat. "He sold it to Mrs. Clara Bennett. Perhaps you remember—" The name hit Ethan like a fist to the sternum. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the roaring in his ears. "Clara. Here. Still here." "I remember," he said, and his voice came out harder than he intended. Wickham glanced at him over his spectacles, a flicker of something, curiosity, pity, crossing his features. "I see. Then you should know that Mrs. Bennett has built quite a successful operation on that land. She's proven herself remarkably capable, against considerable opposition, I might add. She's widowed." It wasn't a question. The lawyer's letter had said as much, but Ethan needed to hear it confirmed, needed to make it real in a way that words on paper couldn't accomplish. "Yes. Her husband, Samuel Bennett, passed away in 1874. Influenza. They'd only been married 2 years. Wickham's voice took on a clinical tone, reciting facts. She's run the property independently since then. Quite unusual for a woman of her age, but as I said, capable. The carriage crested a hill, and suddenly the land opened up before them in a way that stole whatever response Ethan might have made. The valley spread out in shades of gold and green, the mountains rising in the distance like sentinels guarding secrets. And there, nestled in the curve of the creek, was his father's ranch. His ranch now, looking smaller than memory had painted it, but somehow more real. Beyond it, on what had been the southern grazing land, stood a smaller house. Even from this distance, Ethan could see the neat fencing, the well-tended barn, the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. Her home. "There's one more thing," Wickham said quietly. "Your father left instructions. A letter, to be given to you upon your return. He specified that you read it before taking possession of the property." Ethan tore his gaze from the distant house. "Where is it?" "In the ranch house, in his study." He was quite insistent about the location. Wickham paused. "Mr. Cole, I don't know what's in that letter, but I will say this. Your father was a complex man. He made decisions that hurt people, yourself included, I suspect. But toward the end, he seemed determined to set things right, however one might do that." The carriage rolled to a stop in front of the main house. Ethan stepped down, his boots hitting the packed earth of the yard he'd played in as a child. The house loomed before him, 2 stories of weathered wood and shuttered windows, holding within its walls every argument, every disappointment, every moment that had driven him away. Jack Murphy emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. The foreman had aged, more silver in his beard, more lines around his eyes, but his bearing was the same, solid, dependable, unimpressed by pretense. "Ethan." Jack's nod was brief, economical. "Heard you were coming back." "Jack." Ethan met the older man's gaze, finding neither judgment nor welcome there, just acceptance. It was, he realized, more than he deserved. "How've things been?" "Managed?" Jack glanced toward the barn, then back. "Your old man, he had his ways, but the ranch is sound, herd's healthy. You'll want to review the book, see how he's been running things." "I will." Ethan hesitated, then asked the question burning in his throat. "The southern property, Mrs. Bennett, you know her operation?" Something shifted in Jack's expression, not quite a smile, but close. "Claire's done good, real good. Got herself 20 head, rebuilt the barn after a storm in '75, just brought in a breeding bull from back east. Pays her hands fair, treats her stock right. Folk around here respect what she's built." The way Jack said her name, Clara, familiar and warm, sent an unexpected spike of something through Ethan's chest. Jealousy? No. He'd given up any right to that emotion 6 years ago when he'd climbed on a horse and ridden out of her life without looking back. "Good," Ethan said, though the word tasted like ash. "That's good." Wickham cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole, about that letter, I'll read it." Ethan picked up his saddlebag from the carriage. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Wickham. I can manage from here." The attorney looked like he wanted to say more, but thought better of it. He tipped his hat, climbed back into the carriage, and departed in a rattle of wheels and the smell of dust. Ethan stood in the yard, Jack beside him, and stared at the house that was now his burden and his inheritance. "She knows you're back," Jack said quietly. "Saw the telegram that came for you. Hard to keep secrets in a town this size." "I'm not trying to keep secrets." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I came to settle my father's affairs. That's all." But Jack made a sound that might have been agreement or skepticism. With Jack, it was hard to tell. "Letters in the study, second drawer of the desk. Been sitting there for 3 months since your old man passed. Whatever's in it, he wanted you to know." Ethan nodded and walked toward the house. The study smelled of old leather and older tobacco, a scent that transported Ethan back to childhood with a violence that left him dizzy. This had been his father's sanctuary, the place where Robert Cole had dispensed judgment and maintained the iron control that had ruled the ranch and everyone on it. Ethan had hated this room and missed it. The contradiction sat heavy in his chest as he moved to the desk. The letter was exactly where Jack had said it would be, in a sealed envelope bearing his name and his father's precise script. Ethan held it for a long moment, weighing more than paper. Then he broke the seal. Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm dead and you've come home. I don't know if those two facts are connected, if my death was necessary for your return, but I suspect they are. I was never good at admitting fault while I drew breath, so perhaps this is the coward's way. Apologizing when I can't be called to account. There are things you need to know. Things I should have told you years ago, before I drove you away with my pride and my fear. Your mother didn't die in childbirth, as I told everyone. She died 3 months after you were born, but not from complications. She took her own life. I found her in the barn on a February morning, and the sight broke something in me that never healed properly. I learned later, too late, that she'd suffered from what the doctors call melancholia, a darkness of the mind that she'd hidden from everyone, including me, especially me. She'd smile and function and care for you, and then she'd weep alone in our room where she thought no one could hear. I was too blind, too busy with the ranch, too certain that strength meant silence. When you were 22 and told me you wanted to marry Clara Whitfield, I saw history preparing to repeat itself. Clara had lost her mother the same way 2 years prior. The whole town knew, though they spoke of it in whispers. I saw your mother in Clara's eyes. That same shadow, that same fragile brightness, and I panicked. I told you that you couldn't marry her because her family had no land, no prospects, because you were too young. All lies. The truth was that I was terrified. Terrified that you'd suffer what I'd suffered, that you'd wake one morning to find the woman you loved had been consumed by a darkness you couldn't see and couldn't fight. So I issued an ultimatum, the ranch or Clara. I thought I was saving you. I thought I was preventing heartbreak. Instead, I created it. After you left, I watched Clara Whitfield grow into Clara Bennett. I watched her marry Samuel, watched her grieve him, watched her build a life that defied every doubt I'd ever had. She wasn't fragile. She was steel-wrapped in grace, and she never needed saving, least of all from herself. I sold her the southern parcel in 1873. I told myself it was good business, but it wasn't. It was penance. Insufficient penance, but all I could offer. I helped her rebuild after the storm, loaned her money for her breeding stock, and made sure the men in town treated her operation with respect, though truthfully, she earned that herself. I named the Eastern Creek boundary after her. On the property maps, it's called Clara's Run now. The surveyors thought I was being sentimental. They were half right. Son, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I'm asking you to see what I couldn't, that the woman you loved has become someone extraordinary, and that perhaps the story between you isn't finished unless you finish it the same way I did, by choosing fear over faith. The ranch is yours. Do with it what you will, but know that half of what makes it valuable now is the land beside it and the woman who tends it. I'm sorry I wasn't a better father. I'm sorrier still that my worst mistake drove away my only son. Make better choices than I did. Robert Cole. Ethan read the letter 3 times. Then he sat down in his father's chair and put his head in his hands. All of it, the ultimatum, the forced choice, the 6 years of wandering, had been built on fear. His father's fear. And Ethan had accepted it, internalized it, let it become his own. He'd convinced himself that leaving Clara was the noble choice, the selfless one. That he was saving her from himself, from the Cole family history, from a future that would only bring pain. But he'd never asked her, never given her the chance to choose. The sun was setting when Ethan finally left the study. Jack was in the kitchen, heating coffee on the stove. "Read it?" Jack asked without preamble. "Yes." "Figured you might need this then." Jack poured 2 cups, added whiskey to both from a bottle on the shelf. "Your old man wrote that letter 2 weeks before he died. Made me promise I'd make sure you got it, that you'd read it before you saw Clara." Ethan accepted the cup. "He told you what was in it?" "Didn't have to. I knew most of it anyway. This is a small ranch, boy. Men talk. Your father talked more than most toward the end. Guilt makes a man chatty. He helped her. It wasn't a question. He tried to, but Clara's success is hers. She'd have made it with or without Robert Cole's interference." Jack leaned against the counter. "You should know, folks will be watching how you handle this, you being back, her being so close. The gossip's already started." "I'm not here to cause problems." "Didn't say you were. But problems don't always ask permission before showing up." Jack studied him over the rim of his cup. You still love her? The question was so direct, so simple, that Ethan almost laughed. Does it matter? I made my choice 6 years ago. Maybe, but now you got a chance to make a different one. Jack set down his cup. I'm headed into town tomorrow to settle accounts with the feed supplier. You want to come, get reacquainted with the place? No, I need to inventory the property, review the books, see what I've inherited. Suit yourself. Jack moved toward the door, then paused. Fair warning, Clara rides out most mornings to check her herd, follows the creek line, usually around dawn, just so you know where not to be if you're wanting to avoid her. Ethan said nothing, but they both knew he'd heard. He woke before dawn, dressed in the dark, and walked out to the eastern boundary of the property as the sky turned from black to gray. Clara's Run. The creek was low this time of year, more a trickle than a flow, but the grass along its banks was thick and green. Good grazing land. His father had been right about that. About a lot of things, apparently. Ethan settled onto a boulder that overlooked both properties, his own and Clara's, and waited. The sun was just breaking the horizon when he saw her. She rode a bay mare with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent years in the saddle, sitting the horse like she'd been born to it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and she wore a split riding skirt and a simple white blouse, work clothes, not the fancy dress he'd seen on the women in town. She moved with purpose, checking fence lines, studying her herd with an attention that spoke of care and competence. She'd always been beautiful, but this was different. The Clara he'd known at 16 had been lovely in the way of wild roses, soft and sweet and slightly fragile. This woman was something else. There was strength in the line of her shoulders, determination in the set of her jaw. Life had tested her, and she'd answered by becoming unbreakable. Ethan watched her work for 20 minutes, hidden by the boulder and the long shadows of morning. He told himself he was just observing the property, evaluating the neighboring operation. But that was a lie, and he'd never been good at lying to himself. He was memorizing her. The way she sat her horse, the efficiency of her movements. The moment she paused to look out over her land with an expression that might have been pride or might have been determination or might have been both. She never looked his direction, never sensed him there. And when she finally turned her horse back toward her ranch house, Ethan remained on the boulder, watching her ride away. The sun was fully up by the time he returned to his own house. Jack was already in the barn, mucking out stalls, and he gave Ethan a knowing look that said everything without words. "Thought you weren't going to the boundary," Jack said mildly. "Changed my mind." "Uh-huh." Jack returned to his work. Clara's got 2 hired hands. Brothers, Mexicans, good workers. Miguel and Carlos Reyes, they've been with her since she bought the place. You'll probably run into them around the property line. I'm not planning to socialize. Planning and doing are different animals. Jack straightened, leaning on his pitchfork. Look, I'm going to say this once because somebody needs to. You hurt that girl 6 years ago. Hurt her bad. She put herself back together, but that doesn't mean the cracks went away. You want to avoid her? Fine. But if you're going to talk to her, and eventually you will, because these properties share water rights and fence lines, you be straight with her. She deserves that. Ethan met the foreman's gaze. I know. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man who's still running, just in place this time. The words hit harder because they were true. Ethan had spent 6 years moving, always moving, telling himself that motion was progress. But he'd never actually gone anywhere. Not really. All roads had led back here, to this ranch, to this boundary, to the woman he'd left behind. I'll keep that in mind, Ethan said, and walked away before Jack could see how much the observation had shaken him. The next 3 days passed in a blur of work. Ethan threw himself into the ranch with the fervor of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. He reviewed ledgers with Jack, rode the property boundaries, inspected the herd, and made plans for the coming season. The work was familiar, grounding. It gave him purpose that didn't require him to examine the complicated knot of emotions sitting in his chest. On the 4th morning, he was repairing a section of fence along Clara's Run when he heard hoofbeats. He knew it was her before he looked up. Some part of him had been waiting for this moment, dreading it and craving it in equal measure. He straightened slowly, hammer in hand, and turned to face her. Clara Bennett sat her horse 30 feet away, silhouetted against the morning sun. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan had imagined this encounter 1,000 times in the past 6 years, but none of his imagined versions had prepared him for the reality of her. She looked at him with eyes that gave away nothing. Not anger, not happiness, not even surprise. Just a careful, measured evaluation, as if he were a stranger she was assessing for trustworthiness. "Ethan," she said finally. Her voice was exactly as he remembered, low, musical, with a hint of something that might have been irony. "Jack told me you were back." "Clara." His own voice came out rougher than intended. Yes, I came to settle my father's estate. I heard he passed. I'm sorry for your loss." The formal politeness of it stung more than anger would have. They'd once planned to build a life together, and now they were strangers exchanging condolences. "Thank you," Ethan gestured toward the fence. "Water rights issue. Creek's running low, and I wanted to make sure the diversion was working properly. Didn't want to impact your access." "I appreciate that." Clara urged her horse a few steps closer, enough that he could see the fine details he'd been memorizing from a distance. The sun freckles across her nose, the small scar on her chin from when she'd fallen out of a tree at 14. "Your father was careful about the water sharing. I'm sure you'll be the same." "I intend to be." Ethan paused, then added, "Jack tells me you've built something impressive. The ranch, I mean." "Jack's kind." Claire's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "It's been hard work, but it's mine. That counts for something." Mine. The emphasis was subtle, but unmistakable. She wasn't just talking about the ranch. "I'm sure it does." Ethan wanted to say more, wanted to apologize, explain, ask 1,000 questions, but the words stuck in his throat. What right did he have to any of that? He'd made his choice. He'd left. Clara seemed to sense his struggle. She gathered her reins, preparing to leave, and in that moment, Ethan understood that if he let her ride away without saying something real, something honest, the distance between them would only grow. "Clara, wait!" She paused, and for the first time he saw something other than careful neutrality in her expression. Wariness, maybe. Or hope. He couldn't tell. Ethan set down the hammer. "I read my father's letter, the one he left for me. He explained things about why he was so opposed to us, to what we wanted." Clara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And he was wrong about a lot of things, mostly about you." Ethan took a breath. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve to say this, but I'm sorry for leaving the way I did, for not fighting harder." The silence stretched between them like barbed wire. "You don't get to apologize," Clara said finally, and now her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "You don't get to come back after 6 years and offer me sorry, like it's a bouquet of flowers. You made a choice, Ethan. You chose this ranch over everything else, over me. My father gave me an ultimatum, and you took it." The words came out harder than she'd probably intended, and Clara visibly collected herself, regaining the composure she'd lost for a moment. "You could have stayed. You could have chosen differently, but you didn't. I thought I was doing the right thing." "For who?" Clara's eyes blazed. "For me? I never asked you to protect me, Ethan. I never wanted you to be noble or selfless or whatever you told yourself you were being. I wanted you to stay. I wanted you to choose me." The raw pain in her voice hit him like a physical blow. Ethan took a step forward without thinking, and Clara's horse danced sideways, creating distance. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't come closer. Don't try to make this better. You can't." "Clara, we're neighbors now. That's all. I'll respect your property lines if you respect mine, and we'll manage the water rights like civilized people. But don't pretend that letter from your father changes anything. The past is done. Leave it there." She turned her horse with a practiced motion and rode away before Ethan could find words that weren't inadequate. He stood by the creek for a long time after she'd disappeared, the morning sun warming his shoulders, the sound of flowing water the only commentary on what had just transpired. Jack found him there an hour later. "Went about as well as could be expected," the foreman observed. She hates me. No, she doesn't. Jack handed him a canteen. If she hated you, she wouldn't be angry. She'd be indifferent. Anger means she still feels something. That's not comforting. Wasn't meant to be. It's just true. Jack squinted toward Clara's property. That woman survived a husband's death, built a ranch from nothing, and faced down every man in this county who thought she couldn't do it. She's not fragile, and she's not waiting for you to rescue her. If you want anything with her, even just neighborly peace, you're going to have to prove you've changed, that you're someone worth knowing. I don't even know if I am. Then figure it out, because right now you're still the boy who ran away. She needs to see the man who came back. The town of Pine Ridge had grown in Ethan's absence, but it still maintained its frontier character, a hybrid of old Western values and creeping Eastern civilization. The main street boasted new storefronts alongside weathered saloons, and the weekly market drew ranchers and farmers from 50 miles in every direction. Ethan went into town on Saturday, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but really to take the town's temperature, to understand what he was walking into. Jack had warned him that Clara's success had come with opposition, and Ethan wanted to understand what that meant. He got his answer within an hour. The general store was crowded with Saturday shoppers when he entered. Conversations dipped and resumed as people registered his presence, some with curiosity, others with calculation. Ethan was used to being measured by strangers, but this was different. These people remembered him. They knew his history. Ethan Cole. The voice came from behind the counter. Harvey Morton, the store owner, who'd aged considerably since Ethan had last seen him. Heard you were back? Settling your father's affairs? That's right. Your pa was a good man. Steady customer, paid his debts. Town's sorry to lose him. Morton wrapped Ethan's purchases, coffee, tobacco, rifle cartridges. I imagine you'll be staying on, running the ranch? The question was casual, but Ethan sensed the weight behind it. Planning to. Good, good. Ranch needs a firm hand, especially with all the changes lately. Morton's tone shifted, became more pointed. Property values fluctuating, new operations starting up, some more successful than others. Ethan handed over cash. You have something specific you want to say, Harvey? Morton had the grace to look uncomfortable. Just that running a ranch is man's work. Takes strength, experience. Some folks try to do it without proper understanding of what's required. Generally doesn't end well. Are we talking about someone specific? I'm just making observations. But Morton's gaze drifted toward the door, where Clara Bennett had just entered with a shopping list in hand. She saw Ethan immediately, and something passed over her face, frustration, maybe, or resignation. But she lifted her chin and walked to the counter, ignoring him with a determination that was louder than acknowledgement would have been. Mr. Morton, she said crisply, I need to place an order for fence posts, 50 if you can manage it. I'll need them delivered to my property by the end of next week. Morton's smile was all teeth and no warmth. 50 posts is a substantial order, Mrs. Bennett. That'll require payment up front, and I'm not sure my delivery schedule can accommodate next week. You understand. Ethan watched Clara's jaw tighten. She understood perfectly. Morton was making things difficult because he could, because he still believed, despite 3 years of evidence to the contrary, that a woman had no business running a ranch. I can pay up front, Clara said evenly, and I'm sure you can find room in your delivery schedule if you try. Well now, I'd have to check with my driver, see what— I'll take 100 posts, Ethan said suddenly. All eyes turned to him. Delivered to the Cole Ranch. I'll pay up front as well. Morton blinked. 100 posts? Mr. Cole, that's a reasonable order for a ranch my size. You can accommodate that, can't you, Harvey? Or should I take my business to the timber yard in Millsville? The threat was clear. Morton's store depended on the big ranches for survival. Losing the Cole account would hurt. No need for that, Morton said quickly. I can manage 100 posts. And for Mrs. Bennett's order, yes, I'm sure we can work something out. 50 posts, delivered by week's end. That acceptable? Clara turned to Ethan, and the look she gave him was complex, gratitude mixed with irritation, as if she resented needing his intervention even as she recognized its necessity. Thank you, she said stiffly. That wasn't necessary. I know. Ethan kept his voice low. But it shouldn't be necessary for you to fight for basic service, either. It's always necessary. Clara turned back to Morton. I'll be back tomorrow with payment. Have the receipt ready. She left without another word, and Ethan felt the weight of a dozen gazes on his back. That was interesting, a voice drawled from behind him. Ethan turned to find Richard Calhoun, a neighboring rancher whose property sat to the west of the coal spread. Calhoun was 10 years older than Ethan, wealthy and politically connected. He was also, Jack had mentioned, one of the men who'd opposed Clara's expansion most vocally. Just business, Ethan said. Was it? Calhoun's smile was knowing. Looked more personal from where I stood. I'd be careful, Cole. The Bennett woman has ambitions beyond her station. She's been trying to acquire more land, expand her operation. Some of us think she's getting above herself. Ethan felt anger rise in his throat, hot and sudden. Above herself how, exactly? A woman running a ranch alone? It's not natural. Sets a bad precedent. Calhoun's tone was conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. Your father understood that. He helped her to a point, but he knew there were limits. I'm sure you'll see reason the same way. My father, Ethan said carefully, recognized capability when he saw it. From what I hear, Mrs. Bennett has proven herself more than capable. Calhoun's expression hardened. You've been gone a long time, Cole. You don't know how things work around here anymore. The old rules still matter. A woman in her position needs guidance, protection, someone to make sure she doesn't overextend and lose everything she's built. The subtext was clear, someone like Calhoun himself, who'd been making overtures to acquire Clara's property since her husband's death. I think Mrs. Bennett can manage her own affairs, Ethan said. Now, if you'll excuse me. He walked out of the store into the bright afternoon, his purchases under his arm and his temper barely in check. Clara was standing by her wagon, loading supplies with the help of a young ranch hand. She glanced up as Ethan approached, wariness in her eyes. I don't need defending, she said before he could speak. I know. Then why? Because Morton was being an ass, and I had the leverage to stop it. Ethan set down his packages. That's all. I'm not trying to be your savior or your protector or whatever you think I'm doing. I'm just trying to be a decent neighbor. Clara studied him for a long moment, and Ethan had the unnerving sensation of being evaluated, weighed, and found, not wanting, exactly, but suspicious. Neighbors, she repeated. Is that what we're calling it? What else would we call it? I don't know. That's what concerns me. Clara finished securing her supplies and turned to face him fully. 6 years ago, you left me standing in my father's house with a broken heart and a lot of unanswered questions. Now you're back and suddenly you're intervening in my business dealings? What am I supposed to think about that? Think that I'm trying to do better than I did before. Better? Clara's laugh was sharp. Better would have been staying. Better would have been writing. Better would have been anything except silence and absence. You're right. The immediate agreement seemed to surprise her. What? You're right. I handled everything wrong. I took the coward's way out, and I hurt you in the process. I can't undo that. Ethan held her gaze. But I can try to be someone worth knowing now. If you'll let me. Clara shook her head slowly. It's not that simple. I know. You don't get to ride back into town and fix things with a few nice words and an intervention at the general store. I know that too. She seemed at a loss, as if his willingness to agree rather than argue had deflated something. Finally, she said, What do you want from me, Ethan? It was the question he'd been avoiding, the one he didn't have a clean answer to. What did he want? Forgiveness? A second chance? Just the absence of the aching hole her absence had left in his life? Right now? Just a chance to prove I'm not the same person who left. Ethan kept his voice steady. Beyond that, I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe we really are just neighbors. But I'd like to know that we can be that without you hating me. Clara was quiet for so long that Ethan thought she might just climb into her wagon and leave. But instead she said, I don't hate you. I wish I did. It would be easier. Before he could respond to that impossible statement, she was in her wagon, snapping the reins, leaving him standing in the street with more questions than he'd started with. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by a boy from town. Mr. Cole, I'm writing to request a formal meeting regarding water rights management for Clara's run. Recent drought conditions have affected flow levels, and I believe we should establish a fair schedule for access to ensure both properties have adequate supply. If you're amenable, I suggest we meet at the creek boundary this Thursday at 10 in the morning. Please bring any relevant documentation regarding your property's water rights. Respectfully, Mrs. Clara Bennett. The formality of it made Ethan smile despite himself. This was Clara being careful, professional, keeping everything strictly business. She was building walls, and he couldn't blame her, but at least she was willing to meet. Thursday dawned clear and warm, the kind of late summer day that promised heat by afternoon. Ethan rode out to the creek early, bringing the water rights documentation from his father's files. He arrived to find Clara already there, standing beside the creek with a surveyor's notebook and a determined expression. "You're early," she said as he approached. "So are you." Clara gestured toward the creek. "Flow's down 6 inches from where it was last month. We've had less rain than usual, and if the pattern holds, we'll need to manage access carefully to avoid either property being disadvantaged." Ethan dismounted and studied the water level. She was right. The creek was lower than he remembered from his youth. "What do you propose?" "Alternating days. Your cattle access on odd days, mine on even days. We can adjust if rainfall improves, but for now, it distributes the resource fairly." "That seems reasonable." Ethan pulled out his father's documents. According to these, the original water rights agreement specified shared access with priority given to domestic use, meaning the houses get water first, livestock second. Clara nodded. "Samuel and your father had an addendum that clarified the livestock schedule. I have a copy at my ranch. The alternating days approach builds on that framework." They spent the next hour reviewing documents, comparing notes, and establishing a formal schedule. It was, Ethan reflected, possibly the most civilized conversation they'd had since his return. The structure of business gave them safe ground, a way to interact without navigating the minefield of their personal history. But as they finished and prepared to leave, Clara surprised him by saying, "Your father helped me a great deal after Samuel died. I don't know if I ever properly thanked him." Ethan looked up from the documents he was gathering. "He mentioned it in his letter." "What else did he mention?" The question was careful, but Ethan sensed genuine curiosity beneath it. Clara wanted to know what his father had said, what truths had finally been spoken after so many years of silence. "That he misjudged you," Ethan said quietly. "That he let fear guide his decisions, and that by the time he realized his mistake, he'd already done damage that couldn't be easily repaired." Clara absorbed this. "He told me once after the storm in '75 that he regretted many things. He never specified what. I always wondered if you were part of that list." "I was the primary entry, I think." Ethan met her eyes. "He thought he was protecting me from repeating his mistakes. Instead, he ensured I'd make new ones." "By leaving?" "Yes." Clara turned to look out over her property, at the land she'd claimed and cultivated through sheer determination. "Do you know what the hardest part was? Not that you left, though that was hard enough. It was that you didn't trust me to have a say in the decision. You just decided what was best and acted on it, like I was something to be managed rather than someone to share choices with." The words hit home because they were true. Ethan had convinced himself that leaving was noble, selfless, that he was sacrificing his happiness for Clara's well-being. But underneath that narrative had been an assumption that he knew what was best, that his judgment superseded her agency. "You're right," he said. "I didn't give you a choice. I made one for both of us." "Why?" "Because it was easier than risking you choosing differently, than risking—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Risking what?" Claire's voice was softer now, genuinely asking rather than challenging. "Everything," Ethan admitted. "Risking that we'd build something together and then lose it. That I'd fail you the way my father failed my mother. That loving you would lead to losing you in a way I couldn't survive." Clara was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she'd been carrying this truth for a while. "You did lose me, Ethan, just in a different way. The one you chose." The statement sat between them, undeniable and painful. "I know," Ethan said, "and I can't undo it. But maybe we can build something different now." Not what we had before. That's gone. But something new. Something based on who we actually are, rather than who we were. Clara turned to him, and the sunlight caught her face in a way that made his breath catch. She was so beautiful it hurt. But more than that, she was real, solid and present, and undeniably herself in a way that the memory he'd carried for 6 years had never quite captured. "I don't know if I can do that," she said honestly. "Trust you again, I mean. I don't know if I'm brave enough." "Then don't trust me yet. Just don't shut the door completely. Give me a chance to earn it back, however long that takes." Clara studied him, and Ethan could see her weighing the offer, calculating the risk. Finally, she said, "We're neighbors. We have business interests that overlap. We can start there." "But Ethan, I won't be hurt again. If this is going to work in any capacity, you need to be honest, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." "I can do that." "Can you?" The question wasn't challenging, just genuinely uncertain. "Because the Ethan I knew 6 years ago ran when things got difficult. I need to know if you're different now." "I am," Ethan said, and meant it. "Or at least, I'm trying to be. I can't promise I'll get everything right, but I promise I won't run. Not again." Clara nodded slowly. "Then we'll see." "But slowly, Ethan, very slowly." "Slow is good," Ethan agreed. "Slow I can do." They parted ways with a new understanding, not friendship, not yet, but a tentative agreement to try. As Ethan rode back to his ranch, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 6 years. Hope. It was fragile, uncertain, and possibly foolish. But it was there. Okay. The story continues, but this marks the end of part 1. The foundation has been laid. Ethan has returned, faced his past, and begun the long process of proving he's changed. Clara has opened a door, however narrow, to the possibility of something new. The water rights meeting has given them neutral ground to build on, and the town's dynamics have been established. What comes next will test whether Ethan's promise to stay is genuine and whether Clara can risk trusting again. The weeks that followed established a rhythm between them, careful, measured, like two dancers learning steps they'd once known by heart, but had since forgotten. Ethan and Clara met twice more to discuss ranch business, once to coordinate the fall cattle drive to market, and again when a section of shared fence line needed repair. Each meeting was professional, cordial, and maintained the careful distance Clara had insisted upon. Ethan respected those boundaries even as they chafed against what he wanted, which was more time, more conversation, more of everything she was willing to give. September arrived with cooler nights and the first hint of autumn in the air. The ranch work intensified as preparations began for winter, hay to cut and store, equipment to repair, supplies to stockpile. Ethan threw himself into the labor with a focus that impressed even Jack, who'd seen 3 decades of ranch work and knew the difference between a man working and a man running from his thoughts. "You're going to work yourself into the ground," Jack observed one evening as Ethan came in from the fields well after dark, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cooling temperatures. "Just getting things in order." Ethan washed his hands in the basin, scrubbing away the day's grime. "Your father had a crew of 4 men. You're trying to do it with me and occasional help from the Reyes brothers when Clara can spare them." Jack handed him a towel. "Pride's admirable and all, but it don't mend fences faster. I'll hire more hands when I can afford it. Right now, the accounts are tight." It was true, though Ethan hadn't wanted to admit it. His father's books had revealed an operation running at a slim margin with several outstanding debts and equipment that needed replacing. The ranch was solvent, but barely. Making it profitable would require smart decisions and hard work, more of the latter than Ethan had anticipated. Jack leaned against the doorframe, studying him. "You know, your father made a deal with Clara last spring. She needed hands for branding season. He needed someone to fix his equipment. They worked out a trade. Her mechanical skills for his labor. Saved both of them money." Ethan looked up sharply. "Clara fixes equipment?" "Taught herself from manuals. Girl's got a mind for machinery like I've never seen. Samuel was good with his hands, taught her some before he died. After that, she learned the rest on her own because she couldn't afford to keep hiring the blacksmith every time something broke." Jack's expression was carefully neutral. "Just thought you should know. In case you wanted to continue the arrangement, neighborly cooperation and all." The suggestion was transparent, and they both knew it. But Ethan found himself considering it seriously. His plow needed work, and the old thresher his father had used was more rust than function. He could afford repairs, but barely, and the expense would set back other necessary purchases. "I'll think about it," Ethan said finally. "You do that." Jack grabbed his hat from the peg. "I'm headed into town tomorrow for supplies. You need anything?" "Just the usual. Coffee, flour, maybe some tobacco if the budget allows." Jack nodded and left, and Ethan sat alone in the kitchen with his thoughts and a cooling cup of coffee. The house was too quiet, too full of ghosts. His father's presence lingered in every corner, the chair he'd favored by the fireplace, the pipe still resting on the mantel, the faint smell of his tobacco that clung to the curtains. Ethan hadn't changed anything since arriving, hadn't made the space his own. It still felt like he was living in someone else's life, someone else's choices. He found himself thinking about Clara's house, wondering what it looked like inside. Whether she'd made it warm and comfortable, filled it with things that reflected who she was rather than who she'd been expected to be. He imagined her in the evenings, reviewing accounts by lamplight or reading one of the books she'd always loved. Did she still read? Did she still hum while she worked, that unconscious melody that had always made him smile? The questions accumulated like dust, and Ethan had no way to answer them without crossing the boundaries she'd drawn. The next morning, he rode out to inspect the equipment in the far barn and discovered the situation was worse than he'd thought. The plow wasn't just damaged, it was practically destroyed, with a cracked axle and bent blades that would cost more to replace than the entire implement was worth. Ethan stood in the barn, calculating costs he couldn't afford, and felt the weight of inheritance pressing down like a physical thing. He was still standing there an hour later when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Clara appeared in the barn doorway, backlit by morning sun, and for a moment Ethan couldn't breathe. "Jack said you might need someone to look at your equipment," she said without preamble. "I had some time this morning." Ethan found his voice. "You didn't have to come all the way out here. We had an arrangement with your father, unless you want to break it." She raised an eyebrow, challenging him. No, I'd like to continue it, if you're willing." Clara walked into the barn, her boots crunching on the straw-covered floor, and assessed the plow with a practiced eye. She crouched beside it, running her hands over the damaged axle, testing the joints, her expression focused and professional. "This is bad," she said finally, "but not unsalvageable. The axle can be welded. I can do that at my workshop. The blades need reshaping, which is harder but manageable. You'll need new bolts throughout, and the wheel bearings are shot." "How much?" Ethan asked, bracing himself. Clara straightened, wiping her hands on her work pants. "For the repair? 2 days of your time during my hay harvest next week, and maybe help with that fence line between our properties. It's sagging badly on your side." It was generous, and they both knew it. The materials alone would cost more than 2 days of labor, even skilled labor. She was giving him a break, and Ethan wasn't sure whether to be grateful or proud. "That's more than fair," he said carefully. "It's the arrangement your father and I had. I'm just extending it to you." Clara moved to examine the thresher, running her hands over the mechanism with a familiarity that spoke of genuine understanding. "This one's easier. Needs cleaning and oil, new belts. I can walk you through the maintenance if you want to do it yourself." "I'd appreciate that." They spent the next hour working side by side in the barn, Clara explaining the machinery with a patience that reminded Ethan of how she'd once taught him to dance, years ago at a town social. She'd been 16 and laughing, guiding his clumsy feet through the steps, and he'd been too dizzy with love to focus on anything but the way her hand felt in his. Now she was teaching him again, but the context was different. This was practical knowledge, survival skills, the kind of education that meant the difference between a functioning ranch and a failing one. "You really learned all this on your own?" Ethan asked as Clara demonstrated how to tension a belt properly. "Necessity is an excellent teacher." Her tone was matter-of-fact. "When Samuel died, I had 2 choices: sell the ranch and go back east to live with my aunt, or figure out how to make it work. I chose to figure it out." "Why?" "It would have been easier to sell." Clara looked at him, and something flickered in her expression. Not anger, but a fierce determination that was almost frightening in its intensity. "Because it was mine," because everyone said I couldn't do it, because I needed to prove. She stopped, seeming to reconsider her words. I needed to prove it to myself, that I was capable of more than just being someone's daughter or someone's wife, that I could build something that belonged to me. Ethan understood then that her success wasn't just about the ranch. It was about autonomy, about claiming a space in a world that wanted to keep her confined to predetermined roles. She'd fought for every acre, every fence post, every head of cattle, not because she needed to, but because she'd decided she would. You did more than prove it, he said quietly. You built something remarkable. Claire's expression softened slightly. Thank you. That means something, coming from you. Does it? You always saw me clearly. Even when we were young, you never treated me like I was fragile or needed protecting. You just saw me. I think that's part of why it hurt so much when you left, because I thought if anyone would understand that I could handle hard things, it would be you. The honesty of it stole Ethan's response. He wanted to explain, to defend his younger self's choices. But what defense was there? She was right. He'd claimed to be protecting her, but really, he'd been protecting himself from the fear of losing her. I was wrong, he said simply, and I'm sorry. Not just for leaving, but for not trusting you to make your own choices about what you could handle. Clara studied him for a long moment, and Ethan had the sense of being evaluated again, measured against some internal standard she'd developed in his absence. I believe you, she said finally. I don't know what to do with that belief yet, but I believe you. It was, Ethan realized, more than he'd hoped for. They finished with the equipment as the sun reached its zenith, and Clara wiped her hands on a rag, leaving grease smudges that somehow made her look more real, more present than any carefully maintained appearance would have. I'll come back tomorrow to start on the plow, she said. I'll need to take the axle to my workshop, so plan on being without it for a few days. Whatever works for you. Ethan hesitated, then added, Would you stay for lunch? It's nothing fancy, just what Jack's got prepared, but it seems only fair after you spent your morning here. Claire's expression turned wary. Ethan. Just lunch, between neighbors who've been working together. He kept his voice carefully neutral. Nothing more than that. She seemed to wage an internal debate, and Ethan could see the moment she decided to take the risk, however small. All right, just lunch. They walked to the main house together, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been in weeks. Jack was in the kitchen, and if he was surprised to see Clara, he hid it well, simply setting out an extra plate and serving the stew he'd made that morning. The meal was simple but good, and the conversation stayed safely in neutral territory. Weather, market prices, the town's upcoming harvest festival. But underneath the mundane topics, Ethan felt something shifting, some small thawing of the ice that had formed between them. After lunch, Claire prepared to leave, and Ethan walked her to her horse. Thank you, he said, for coming, for agreeing to help. It's just the arrangement your father and I had, Clara said, but there was something in her tone that suggested it might be slightly more than that. Still, I appreciate it. Clara mounted her horse with easy grace, then looked down at him. Ethan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. All right. Are you staying? Really staying? Or is this just temporary until you settle the estate and find somewhere else to run to? The question was fair, and Ethan respected her for asking it directly rather than dancing around her concerns. I'm staying, he said firmly. This is home. It took me 6 years and a lot of mistakes to understand that, but I'm here. For good. Clara nodded slowly. Then I guess we'll be neighbors for a while. Guess so. She rode away, and Ethan watched until she disappeared from view, feeling something that might have been hope or might have been the beginning of healing. Maybe they were the same thing. The days that followed established a new pattern. Came to work on the equipment as promised, spending hours in Ethan's workshop with the damaged plow. True to her word, she showed him how to make the repairs himself, teaching him welding basics and metalwork with a patience that surprised him. In return, Ethan showed up at her ranch for the hay harvest, working alongside her hired hands to bring in the crop before the weather turned. It was during that harvest that Ethan truly understood what Clara had built. Her operation was smaller than his, but more efficient, with better equipment and a workforce that was loyal because she treated them fairly. Miguel and Carlos Reyes worked with the precision of men who took pride in their labor, and they clearly respected their employer in a way that went beyond simple payment for services. Senora Clara is good boss, Miguel told Ethan during a water break, his English heavily accented but clear. She pay fair, she listen to ideas, she work as hard as any man. My brother and me, we stay because she treat us like family. It was a simple endorsement, but it told Ethan everything he needed to know about the kind of leader Clara had become. On the third day of harvest, a complication arose. Richard Calhoun appeared at the property line, sitting his horse with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him deference. "Mrs. Bennett," he called out, "might I have a word?" Clara straightened from the hay bale she'd been securing, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Mr. Calhoun, what can I do for you?" "I've come to renew my offer for your property. I'm prepared to increase my price by 15%. It's a generous offer, and I think you'll find it's in your best interest to accept." Ethan, working several yards away, felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard about Calhoun's persistent attempts to acquire Clara's land, but hearing it firsthand was different. "My answer remains the same," Clara said, her voice level but firm. "The property is not for sale." "Clara." Calhoun's tone shifted, became almost paternal in its condescension. "Be reasonable. You've done well here, but winter's coming. Running a ranch alone through a Montana winter is challenging even for experienced men. You're overextended as it is. Sell now while the offer's good, and you can relocate somewhere more suitable." "Suitable for whom?" Clara's eyes flashed. "I'm doing fine, Mr. Calhoun. My operation is profitable, my debts are paid, and I have no interest in relocating. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to finish." "You're making a mistake," Calhoun's voice hardened. "This land would be better managed as part of a larger operation. My operation. I have the resources, the experience, and I have the legal deed." Clara cut him off. "This conversation is over." Calhoun's expression darkened, and Ethan saw the moment the man's facade of politeness cracked. "You think Cole being back changes things? That having him sniffing around will protect you? He left you once, Clara. He'll leave again. Men like him always do." Ethan dropped the hay fork he'd been holding and walked toward Calhoun's horse with deliberate slowness. Every instinct screamed at him to knock the man off his mount, but he controlled it, channeled it into something more useful. "Mr. Calhoun," he said quietly, and something in his tone made the older man's eyes narrow. "Mrs. Bennett has asked you to leave. I suggest you respect that." "This isn't your concern, Cole." "Actually, it is. You're on property where I'm working, harassing my neighbor. That makes it my concern." Ethan kept his voice level, reasonable, but let steel show through. "Now, you can leave peacefully, or I can help you leave. Your choice." For a moment, Calhoun looked like he might push the confrontation, but something in Ethan's stance, or perhaps in the way Miguel and Carlos had stopped working to watch with their hands near their belts, changed his mind. "This isn't finished," Calhoun said to Clara, ignoring Ethan entirely. "You'll see reason eventually." He rode off, and the tension in the air dissipated slowly, like smoke clearing. Clara turned to Ethan, and her expression was complicated. Gratitude mixed with frustration, the same combination he'd seen at the general store weeks earlier. "I had that handled," she said. "I know." "Then why?" "Because he was being threatening, and because I was standing right there." Ethan held her gaze. "I'm not trying to fight your battles for you, Clara, but I'm also not going to stand by and watch someone intimidate you. Those aren't the same thing." Clara opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to reconsider. Finally, she said, "He's been trying to buy me out since Samuel died. Gets more aggressive every time I refuse." "Has he threatened you before?" "Not directly, but there have been incidents. Cattle that wandered onto his property and didn't wander back. Supplies that got delayed or damaged in transit. Nothing I could prove, but enough to make things difficult." Anger burned in Ethan's chest, hot and righteous. "Why haven't you gone to the sheriff?" "With what evidence? A feeling? Suspicions?" Clara shook her head. "Calhoun's connected. He has friends on the town council, business relationships with half the county. My word against his wouldn't carry much weight, so I've been careful, documented everything, and refused to be intimidated." You shouldn't have to deal with that alone. I'm not alone. I have Miguel and Carlos. I have Jack checking on me when he comes to town. I have a few friends who've proven reliable. Clara's expression softened slightly. And apparently, I have a neighbor who's willing to stand with me, even if I didn't ask him to. It wasn't quite gratitude, but it was acknowledgement, and Ethan would take it. They finished the harvest as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Ethan helped Clara secure the last of the hay in her barn, and when they finally stopped working, both of them were covered in dust and exhausted in the way that only honest labor could accomplish. "Thank you," Clara said as they stood in the barn doorway, watching the last light fade. "For your help today, all of it." "It was just the arrangement," Ethan said, echoing her earlier words back to her. Clara smiled just slightly. "Was it?" "Maybe not entirely," he admitted. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and Ethan felt the distance between them contract just a little more. It was progress, incremental and fragile, but real. "My father's papers," Ethan said suddenly. "He mentioned helping you after the storm in '75. I've been going through his records trying to understand the full scope of the estate. There are documents I don't understand, loans forgiven, land transfers, things that don't make sense from a pure business standpoint." Clara's expression became guarded. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking what really happened between you and my father after I left. How deep did his involvement go?" It was a dangerous question, treading close to territories they'd been avoiding, but Ethan needed to understand, needed to piece together the years he'd missed. Clara was quiet for a long time, weighing her response. Finally, she said, "Your father came to see me 3 months after you left. I was not in a good place. Samuel had proposed, and I'd accepted because it seemed like the sensible thing to do. Move forward, build a life, stop waiting for something that clearly wasn't going to happen." The words cut, but Ethan didn't interrupt. "Your father told me he'd made a mistake, that he'd driven you away with his ultimatum, and that he regretted it. He said," Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. "He said that he'd been wrong about me, that he'd let fear guide his judgment, and that he wanted to make amends. He couldn't bring you back, but he could help me build the life I deserved. So he sold you the land, at a price far below market value. And when Samuel died 2 years later, when I was drowning in debt and grief, and everyone said I should sell and go back east, your father gave me a loan. No interest, no aggressive repayment schedule, just help. He said it was what he should have done from the beginning, supported me instead of trying to control the situation." Ethan felt emotions warring in his chest, gratitude toward his father for helping Clara, anger that the help had been necessary in the first place, sadness for all the wasted years. "He never told me any of this," Ethan said. "He wanted to. After you'd been gone about 3 years, he started talking about contacting you, trying to bring you home. But he didn't know where you were, and I think he was afraid. Afraid you wouldn't come back. Afraid that reaching out would just confirm that he'd lost you completely. He had lost me, until he died. The irony was bitter. He had to die before I'd come home." "Maybe that's the tragedy," Clara said softly, "that both of you were waiting for the other to make the first move, and neither of you were brave enough to do it while it mattered." The truth of it settled over Ethan like a weight. He and his father had been more alike than he'd wanted to admit, both proud, both afraid, both willing to sacrifice connection rather than risk vulnerability. "I don't want to make the same mistake with you," Ethan said, the words coming out before he could second-guess them. "Waiting too long, letting pride or fear keep me from saying what needs to be said." Clara turned to look at him fully, and in the dying light, her face was a study in conflicted emotions. "What needs to be said?" "That I still—" Ethan stopped, recognizing the precipice he was about to step off. Too much, too soon. Clara had asked for slow, and he owed her that. "That I value having you as a neighbor, as someone I can work with and trust, and that I hope, eventually, we might be friends again." It wasn't what he wanted to say, but it was what Clara needed to hear. The truth offered in increments she could manage. Clara's expression relaxed slightly, some tension easing from her shoulders. "I'd like that. Eventually." "Eventually is good," Ethan agreed. He left as full darkness settled over the valley, riding home under a sky full of stars that seemed brighter than they had any right to be. The conversation with Clara had cracked something open in him, a door he'd kept locked for 6 years, afraid of what might escape if he let it open. But maybe, he thought, as his horse picked its way along the familiar trail, maybe some doors were meant to be opened. Maybe some risks were worth taking, even if they led to pain, or maybe especially then. When Ethan reached his ranch, Jack was waiting on the porch, smoking his pipe and watching the stars. "Heard Calhoun paid Clara a visit today," Jack said without preamble. "News travels fast." "Always does. Miguel stopped by on his way home, told me what happened, said you handled it well." "I just stood there," Ethan said. "Sometimes that's all it takes. Calhoun's used to Clara being alone, easy to pressure. Having someone stand with her changes the equation." Jack puffed on his pipe. "He won't like it, though. Man like that doesn't take well to being challenged." "Then he shouldn't challenge people who aren't interested in backing down." Jack smiled in the darkness. "Your father would have said something similar. He had his faults, but he didn't abide bullies." Ethan sat down on the porch steps, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. "Jack, what really happened between my father and Clara after I left? I've got her version, but I want yours." Jack was quiet for a moment, considering. "Your father realized he'd made a mistake. Took him about 6 months, but he got there. Started trying to fix things the only way he knew how, with money and land and practical help. He couldn't bring you back. Couldn't undo the hurt he'd caused, but he could make sure Clara had what she needed to succeed. Became kind of obsessed with it, actually. Making sure she was protected, that she had resources, that the men in town treated her fair." "Was he in love with her?" "No, nothing like that." Jack's response was immediate and certain. "It wasn't about Clara specifically. It was about redemption. About proving to himself that he could do right by someone, even if he couldn't do right by you. She became a project, I guess. A way to make amends by proxy." "Did she know that?" "I think so. Clara's smart. She understood what he was doing and why. But she also needed the help, so she accepted it. They had an understanding, those two. Mutual respect built on complicated foundations." Ethan absorbed this, fitting it into the picture he'd been building of the years he'd missed. His father and Clara, forming an unlikely alliance based on shared regret and mutual benefit. It was messy and imperfect and very human. "I think he left me that letter hoping I'd finish what he started," Ethan said finally. "Not just running the ranch, but whatever he was trying to build with Clara. Some kind of bridge." "Maybe," Jack agreed. "Or maybe he just wanted you to have the truth before you had to figure everything out on your own. Either way, what you do with it is up to you." That night, Ethan lay in his father's bed, his bed now, and stared at the ceiling, his mind too full for sleep. The house creaked and settled around him, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. He thought about Clara alone in her house, probably reviewing accounts or reading by lamplight. He thought about Calhoun and his persistent harassment. He thought about his father's letter and the weight of inherited regrets. And he thought about the careful progress he and Clara had made, the slow thawing of ice, the tentative rebuilding of trust. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was something, a foundation maybe, a possibility. Eventually exhaustion claimed him, and he slept. The first snow came early that year, dusting the valley in white 2 weeks before November. Ethan woke to a transformed landscape, the familiar contours of his property softened under a blanket of crystalline silence. He dressed quickly, the cold biting through the walls of the house, and went to check on the livestock before the sun fully rose. Jack was already in the barn, mucking stalls with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd done this work for 40 winters. "Going to be a hard season," Jack said without looking up. "Old-timers in town are saying it'll be the coldest in 20 years. Creek will freeze solid by January if they're right." Ethan grabbed a pitchfork and joined him. "We prepared?" "We are. Can't speak for everyone else." Jack's meaning was clear. Clara's operation was smaller, more vulnerable to the kind of brutal winter the old-timers were predicting. "She'll be fine," Ethan said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "She's been through winters before. Not like this one's shaping up to be, and not with Calhoun circling like a vulture, waiting for her to stumble." Jack paused in his work. Might want to check on her. Neighborly concern and all. Ethan knew manipulation when he heard it, but he also knew Jack was right. He finished his morning chores and saddled his horse, telling himself this was just practical, making sure a neighbor was prepared for bad weather. Nothing more complicated than that. The ride to Clara's property took 20 minutes through the fresh snow. Smoke rose from her chimney, and he could see Miguel and Carlos working near the barn, their breath visible in the cold air. Clara herself was on the roof of her equipment shed, hammering at loose shingles with determined focus. "You're going to break your neck," Ethan called up to her. Clara looked down, and her expression cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been pleasure before settling on mild irritation. "I'm being careful." "That's what people say right before they fall." Ethan dismounted and moved to the base of the ladder. "Let me help." "I can manage." "I know you can, but two people work faster than one, and it looks like this storm is just the beginning of a rough winter." He kept his voice practical, reasonable. "Besides, you helped me with the equipment. Consider this returning the favor." Clara hesitated, pride warring with pragmatism, before finally nodding. "Fine, but I'm not helpless." "Never said you were." They worked together for the next 2 hours, repairing the shed roof and checking the other buildings for weather damage. Miguel and Carlos joined them, and the four of them moved through Clara's property with the synchronized efficiency of a good crew. Ethan found himself impressed again by how well Clara had organized her operation. Everything had its place. Everything was maintained, nothing was left to chance. "Your husband taught you well," Ethan said as they took a break for coffee that Carlos brought from the house. Clara's expression shifted, became more guarded. "Samuel taught me some, but most of what I know I learned after he was gone. Necessity and all that." It was the first time she'd spoken of her late husband directly to Ethan, and he sensed he was treading on delicate ground. But curiosity pushed him forward. "What was he like, Samuel?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring out at her land with eyes that seemed to see into the past. "He was kind, patient. He knew I didn't love him the way a wife should love a husband, and he married me anyway. Said love could grow if we gave it time and care. Did it? I learned to love him, yes. Not the way I loved—" She stopped abruptly, seeming to catch herself. "Not the way young love feels, but it was real. He was good to me, and I tried to be good to him. When he died, I grieved honestly. He deserved that much." The unspoken comparison hung between them. Samuel, who had been chosen out of practicality and grown into genuine affection, versus what Clara had felt for Ethan, which had been consuming and absolute and ultimately devastating. "I'm glad you had someone who treated you well," Ethan said, and meant it despite the complicated emotions the conversation stirred. "So am I." Clara turned to look at him directly. "He gave me this ranch, used his savings to make the down payment on the land your father sold us. When he died, he left everything to me with a letter saying he knew I'd make something of it. He believed in me when most people didn't. He was smarter than most people then." Clara's lips quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "He had his moments." They returned to work, the conversation shifting to safer topics. Supplies needed for winter, market prices for spring calves, the territorial legislature's new land policies. But something had shifted between them. Some small increment of trust extended and accepted. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Ethan prepared to leave. Clara walked him to his horse, and her breath made small clouds in the freezing air. "Thank you for coming," she said, "for the help. That's what neighbors do." "Is that all we are?" The question came out before she seemed to mean it to, and Clara looked almost surprised by her own boldness. Ethan considered his response carefully, knowing that whatever he said would matter. "I don't know what we are yet, but I know what I'd like us to become, if you're willing to let that happen." "And what's that?" "Friends, real friends, the kind who trust each other with hard truths and show up when it matters." He paused. "And maybe, eventually, something more. But only if you want that too. Only if we build toward it honestly." Clara searched his face, and Ethan let her look, hiding nothing. Finally she said, "I think I'd like that. The friends part, at least. The rest, we'll see." "We'll see is good," Ethan agreed. "It's better than no." He rode home as darkness settled, feeling lighter than he had in months. It wasn't everything he wanted, But it was progress, and progress, he was learning, was enough. The winter that followed was as brutal as the old-timers had predicted. Snow fell heavy and constant, drifting against buildings and fences, making travel between properties difficult. Ethan and Jack worked from dawn to dusk, keeping the operation running, breaking ice on water troughs, feeding livestock, repairing damage from the weight of snow and the bite of wind. But through it all, Ethan made a point of checking on Clara. Sometimes it was a quick visit to share supplies or help with a difficult task. Other times it was longer, an afternoon spent reinforcing her barn against the wind, or an evening when he and Jack brought over extra firewood and stayed for dinner. Clara seemed to accept these visits with growing comfort, the walls she'd built gradually lowering. They fell into an easy rhythm, the kind that came from shared work and mutual respect. Miguel and Carlos treated Ethan as an extension of Clara's crew, and Jack formed a quiet friendship with Clara based on their shared practicality and dry humor. It was during one of these visits, in late December, that everything changed. Ethan had ridden over to help Clara move her herd to winter pasture. The cattle were reluctant, made stubborn by cold and the deep snow, and it took all four of them, Ethan, Clara, Miguel, and Carlos, to get the animals moving. They'd been working for hours when Clara's horse suddenly spooked, rearing up with a whinny of alarm. Later, they'd discover what had startled the mare, a cougar track, fresh in the snow. But in the moment, all Ethan saw was Clara losing her seat, her body tilting backward in a way that would send her crashing to the frozen ground. He moved without thinking, spurring his horse forward and catching Clara around the waist as she fell. The impact knocked them both sideways, and they tumbled into a snowdrift together, a tangle of limbs and winter gear and pure instinct. For a moment, they just lay there, stunned. Then Clara started laughing, a bright sound that cut through the cold like summer sunlight. "Are you hurt?" Ethan managed, though his own breath was knocked from his lungs. "Only my dignity." Clara rolled off him, sitting up in the snow with her hair escaped from its braid and her cheeks flushed with cold and adrenaline. Thank you. That could have been bad. It wasn't your fault. Something spooked your horse." Miguel had caught the runaway mare and was examining her, calling out about tracks he'd found. Carlos was checking the herd, but Ethan's attention stayed fixed on Clara, on the way her eyes sparkled with leftover fear and present amusement, on the curve of her mouth as she tried to suppress her smile. "You look ridiculous," she said, and he realized he was covered head to toe in snow, his hat lost somewhere in the drift. "You're not exactly presentable yourself." Clara looked down at herself, coat askew, snow clinging to every surface, one boot missing, and laughed again. It was the freest sound Ethan had heard from her since his return, unguarded and genuine. "We're a mess," she admitted. "Yeah." Ethan found himself smiling. "We really are." Their eyes met and something passed between them. A moment of recognition, of seeing each other clearly without the weight of past or future pressing down. Just two people sitting in a snowdrift, cold and disheveled and improbably happy. Miguel called out that he'd found cougar tracks, breaking the spell. They pulled themselves from the snow, recovered Clara's boot, and finished moving the herd with extra vigilance. But something had shifted between them, some final barrier dissolving in the shared ridiculousness of the fall. That evening, Clara invited Ethan to stay for dinner. It was a simple meal, stew and bread, nothing fancy, but they ate together at her small kitchen table and talked like they hadn't talked in years. About everything and nothing. About childhood memories and shared friends. About books they'd read and places they'd dreamed of seeing. About the kind of inconsequential things that built intimacy through their very ordinariness. "I used to imagine what my life would be like at 30, Clara said as they finished eating. "When I was 16 and thought I knew everything about how the world worked, I thought I'd be married with children, living on a ranch somewhere, happy in a simple, uncomplicated way. And instead? Instead, I'm widowed and childless and running a ranch that takes everything I have just to keep functioning. And She paused, seeming to search for the right word. "I'm satisfied. Not happy exactly, but satisfied. I built something that's mine. That counts for more than I thought it would." "You're remarkable," Ethan said quietly. "I hope you know that." Clara's expression softened. "I'm just stubborn. There's a difference." No, there's not. Not the way you do it. She looked at him across the table, and Ethan saw vulnerability in her eyes that she usually kept hidden. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed? If we'd married like we planned? Every day, Ethan admitted, but I'm starting to think that maybe the question isn't useful. We can't know what would have been. We only know what is. And what is it? Two people who hurt each other learning to trust again, building something new from what's left of something old. He reached across the table, slow enough that she could pull away if she wanted, and took her hand. I think that might be worth more than what we had before, because we're choosing it now, as adults who understand what we're risking. Claire's fingers tightened around his. I'm scared, Ethan, of trusting you, of believing this is real and then discovering it's not. I'm scared too, but I'm here anyway. That has to count for something. They sat in the quiet warmth of her kitchen, hands linked across the table, and let the fear exist alongside the hope. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture. It was small and tentative and profoundly honest. When Ethan finally left, riding through the crystalline darkness back to his own ranch, he felt something he'd thought lost forever. The sense that the future might hold more than just atonement and hard work, that it might hold joy. The new year arrived with a blizzard that trapped everyone indoors for 3 days. Ethan spent the time reviewing his father's papers more thoroughly, trying to understand the full scope of the estate. What he discovered troubled him. His father hadn't just helped Clara after Samuel's death. He'd systematically worked to protect her from Calhoun's attempts to acquire her land, using his influence and connections to block several schemes that Ethan hadn't known existed. There were notes about meetings with town council members, conversations with the Territorial Land Office, even a confrontation with Calhoun himself that had ended with threats on both sides. Robert Cole had been fighting a quiet war on Clara's behalf, and it hadn't ended with his death. If anything, his passing had emboldened Calhoun, who no longer had to contend with the older Cole's protective presence. Ethan showed the papers to Jack, who read them with a grim expression. Your father knew Calhoun wouldn't stop, Jack said. That's why the letter was so urgent. He was passing the torch to you, hoping you'd continue what he started. Fighting someone else's battles for them isn't protecting them, Jack. It's treating them like they can't fight for themselves. Normally, I'd agree. But Calhoun's got resources Clara doesn't have. Money, political connections, men who'll do his dirty work for a price. She's been holding him off through sheer determination and your father's support. Without that support, Jack trailed off meaningfully. She needs to know what she's facing, all of it, not just what she's seen herself. Ethan gathered the papers. I need to tell her. She might not thank you for it. Probably not, but she deserves the truth. The storm broke on the 4th day, leaving the valley buried under 3 feet of new snow. Ethan waited another day for the paths to clear, then rode to Clara's ranch with his father's papers in his saddlebag and dread in his gut. She was in her barn, tending to a cow that had calved during the storm. The newborn calf was weak, struggling to stand, and Clara worked with gentle efficiency to help it nurse. New life, Ethan said from the doorway. That's hopeful. Clara looked up, and her smile was tired but genuine. Little fighter, born in the middle of the worst of the storm. If she survives the next few days, she'll thrive. They watched the calf together for a moment, then Ethan said, I need to talk to you about something. It's not pleasant. Clara's expression shifted, became guarded. All right. They moved to her kitchen, where Ethan spread his father's papers across the table. He walked her through everything, the extent of Calhoun's schemes, his father's interventions, the political maneuvering that had been happening behind the scenes for years. Clara's face grew paler with each revelation, anger and shock warring for dominance. Your father was manipulating town politics without telling me? Her voice was tight with controlled fury. Making deals and blocking proposals that affected my property, and he never thought to inform me? He thought he was helping. He thought I was helpless. Clara stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. All this time I thought I was succeeding on my own merit, building something through my own work. But it was your father pulling strings, protecting me like I was some fragile thing that couldn't manage without a man's interference. That's not fair, Ethan said, though he understood her anger. You did build this on your own. Your success is real. My father just made sure you had a fair playing field. A fair playing field I didn't know was tilted in the first place. Clara's eyes blazed. Don't you see? This is exactly what I was trying to escape. Men deciding what I could handle, making choices for me without my input, treating me like I couldn't be trusted with the full truth about my own life. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow because they echoed the same complaint she'd made about him, about his choice to leave without giving her a say in the decision. You're right, he said quietly. My father was wrong not to tell you, and I'm wrong for waiting this long to share what I found. But Clara, Calhoun isn't going to stop. He's been circling for years, and without my father's interference, he's going to get more aggressive. You need to know what you're facing. Clara sank back into her chair, her anger deflating into something more complicated. I knew Calhoun was a problem. I just didn't know how big of one. Ethan pulled out the last document, a map showing land parcels Calhoun had been systematically acquiring, all of them surrounding Clara's property. He's been boxing you in. Buy up enough of the adjacent land, control access to water and roads, and he can strangle your operation without directly attacking you. That's illegal. It's clever, and hard to prove malicious intent. Ethan traced the pattern on the map. But there's a piece he hasn't acquired yet, here. He pointed to a small parcel to the east of Clara's property. It's been owned by the Harrison family, but I heard old man Harrison died last spring. His heirs might be looking to sell. Clara leaned forward, studying the map. If I could buy that parcel, it would give me access to the northern road. I wouldn't be dependent on routes that cross Calhoun's land. Exactly. But I can't afford it. Not this year, not with winter hitting so hard. My reserves are nearly depleted. They sat in silence, the magnitude of the problem settling over them like snow. Clara had worked for years to build her independence, only to discover that independence was more fragile than she'd believed. And Calhoun, patient and ruthless, had been positioning himself to take advantage of the moment when her resources finally ran out. What if we went in together? Ethan said suddenly. A partnership. We pool resources to buy the Harrison parcel, hold it jointly, ensure access for both properties. Clara looked at him sharply. Why would you do that? Because it's good business. Because having Calhoun control all the adjacent land hurts my operation too. And because Ethan met her gaze steadily. Because I meant what I said about being here, about standing with you. This is me proving that. A business partnership. To start with, yes. Just business. Clear terms, legal documentation, equal investment, and equal benefit. He paused. Though I'm hoping that eventually it might be more than just business. Clara's expression was unreadable. You're asking me to tie my financial future to yours. I'm offering to tie mine to yours. There's a difference. Ethan leaned forward. Clara, I know trust is hard. I know I have to earn it. But at some point, one of us has to take a risk. Let it be me. If this fails, if I prove unreliable, you still own your land free and clear. But if it works, we both win. She studied him for a long moment, and Ethan could see her calculating odds, weighing options, trying to determine if this was genuine or another form of the paternalistic protection she'd been fighting against. Equal partners, she said finally. Equal investment, equal say in decisions. You don't make choices for me or try to protect me from information you think I can't handle. Agreed. And if things go wrong between us personally, if we try for more than friendship and it doesn't work, the business arrangement stands. I won't lose my security because of romantic complications. We'll put it in writing. Ethan extended his hand across the table. Partners? Clara looked at his offered hand, at his face, searching for something. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she reached out and clasped his hand firmly. Partners. They shook on it, and Ethan felt the weight of the promise settle over him. This wasn't just a business deal. It was a declaration of intent, a commitment to building something together. It was trust, tentative and cautious, but real. The next week was consumed with logistics. Ethan contacted the Harrison heirs, negotiated a price, and arranged financing. Clara reviewed every document with meticulous care, catching details Ethan had missed and suggesting amendments that strengthened their position. They worked together with surprising efficiency, their different strengths complementing each other. Ethan's connections and understanding of territorial politics balancing Clara's attention to detail and financial acumen. The partnership agreement they drafted was thorough, to the point of being excessive, but Clara insisted on covering every contingency. "Hope for the best, plan for the worst," she said, and Ethan couldn't fault the wisdom. When they finally signed the papers in the lawyer's office in town, witnessed by Thomas Wickham and recorded in the county records, Ethan felt something settle in his chest. This was real, permanent. They were bound together now, not just by history or attraction, but by mutual interest and legal obligation. Richard Calhoun heard about the partnership within 2 days, small towns being what they were. He appeared at Clara's ranch unannounced, his expression thunderous. "You made a mistake, Clara," he said without preamble. "Going into business with Cole, he'll take advantage, drain your resources, and leave you worse off than before." "That's my risk to take," Clara said coolly, "and I don't recall asking for your advice." "I'm trying to help you." "No, you're trying to control me. There's a difference." Clara crossed her arms. "The Harrison parcel is no longer available, Mr. Calhoun. Perhaps you should focus your ambitions elsewhere." Calhoun's jaw tightened. "You think this partnership protects you? Cole's father is dead. The old alliances are broken. You're going to find that you have fewer friends than you believed. And you're going to find that Clara has more allies than you assumed," Ethan said, stepping out of the barn where he'd been working. "Including me, and I don't respond well to threats." The two men stared at each other, and the air crackled with tension. Calhoun was older, wealthier, more established, but Ethan was younger, harder, and utterly unwilling to back down. "This isn't over," Calhoun said finally. "No," Ethan agreed. "I don't imagine it is. But the terms have changed. That's something you should keep in mind." Calhoun left, and Clara let out a breath she'd been holding. That could have gone worse. Could have gone better, too. "True." Clara turned to him. "Thank you for standing with me. Again." "Always," Ethan said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They stood together in the cold winter sunlight, partners in business, and something more that neither was quite ready to name. The past was still there, complicated and painful, but it no longer controlled them. They were writing a new story now, one choice at a time, one risk at a time. And for the first time since returning home, Ethan believed they might actually succeed. Spring came late that year, the snow refusing to release its grip until well into April. But when it finally arrived, it came with a rush of green and the kind of warmth that made the brutal winter feel like a distant memory. The valley transformed overnight, brown earth giving way to new grass, and the air filled with birdsong and the constant trickle of snowmelt feeding the creek. Ethan and Clara spent those first weeks of thaw working the land with a determination born of partnership and something deeper neither was quite ready to acknowledge. The Harrison parcel needed fencing, and they tackled the project together, their crews working side by side to establish clear boundaries and proper gates. Miguel and Carlos moved between properties with easy familiarity now, and Jack had taken to eating dinner at Clara's ranch as often as at Ethan's, drawn by her sharp wit and Carlos's exceptional cooking. It was during one of these joint work sessions, as they stretched wire between posts and argued companionably about the best height for the fence, that Ethan realized something fundamental had changed. They weren't just partners anymore. They were friends, real friends, the kind who could disagree without it threatening the foundation of their relationship, who could work in comfortable silence or talk for hours about nothing important. "You're smiling," Clara observed, pausing to wipe sweat from her forehead. "What's amusing?" "Nothing, just thinking that this is nice, working together." "Nice," Clara tested the word like it might be a trap. "That's a very diplomatic description. What would you call it?" She considered, her head tilted in that way she had when she was being honest, despite her instinct toward self-protection. "Surprisingly easy. I expected partnership to feel more like compromise, but this feels more like complementing. Your strengths cover my weaknesses and vice versa. Is that your way of saying you like working with me? Don't let it go to your head." But Clara was smiling, and the sight of it made Ethan's chest feel too tight for his ribs. They finished the fence as the sun began its descent and stood back to admire their work. The neat line of posts and wire represented more than just property boundaries. It was physical proof of their collaboration, their ability to build something together that was stronger than what either could have created alone. "We make a good team," Ethan said quietly. Clara glanced at him, and something flickered in her expression, acknowledgement perhaps, or the beginning of allowing herself to believe. "We do. Though I suspect that surprises you as much as it surprises me." "Why would it surprise me?" "Because 6 months ago we could barely stand to be in the same space, and now," she gestured at the fence, the land, the easy way their crews worked together. "Now this. People change. Situations change." Ethan kept his voice careful, aware they were approaching territory they'd been dancing around for months. "Or maybe we're just finally becoming the people we were supposed to be all along." Clara was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability that cut straight through him. "Do you ever wonder if we're making a mistake, building all of this on a foundation that's already cracked?" "Every day," Ethan admitted. "But I think maybe the cracks are what make it stronger. We know what failure looks like now. We know what it costs. That makes us more careful, more intentional about what we're building. Or it makes us more likely to repeat the same patterns." Clara turned to face him fully. "Ethan, I need you to understand something. I'm trying, really trying to trust you again. But there's a part of me that's still waiting for you to leave, to find some reason that staying is too hard and disappear like you did before." The words hurt because they were fair, because Ethan had earned that distrust through his own choices. "I can't prove I won't leave. Not with words. I can only prove it by staying, day after day, until you believe it. And if that takes years, then it takes years." Ethan stepped closer, not touching, but near enough that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes, the small scar on her chin that he'd once kissed on a summer night that felt like a lifetime ago. "I'm not going anywhere, Clara. You're stuck with me." She searched his face, and Ethan let her look, hiding nothing. Finally, she said, "Then I suppose I'd better get used to having you around." It wasn't a declaration of love or even romance, but it was trust, tentative and fragile and impossibly precious. Ethan would take it. The town's spring festival arrived in early May, a celebration of survival through another harsh winter. The main street filled with vendors and music, children running between booths while adults gathered to trade gossip and conduct business. It was expected that everyone would attend, social obligation mixed with genuine pleasure, and Ethan found himself looking forward to it in a way he hadn't expected. Clara arrived at his ranch that morning in the wagon, dressed in a blue cotton dress that matched her eyes and made Ethan forget how to form complete sentences. "You clean up well," she said with amusement as he stood there staring like a fool. "So do you." He managed to collect himself enough to help her down from the wagon, and the brief contact of his hands on her waist sent electricity through his entire body. "Ready to face the gossips?" "As ready as I'll ever be." Clara straightened her skirts. "You know, everyone will be watching us, making assumptions. Let them." Ethan offered his arm. "We know the truth, that's what matters." They arrived in town to discover the festival in full swing. Music poured from the gazebo where a small band played, and the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the air. People called out greetings as they passed, and Ethan felt the weight of curious gazes following their progress. Harvey Morton, manning a booth for his general store, gave them a knowing smile. "Mr. Cole, Mrs. Bennett, good to see you both looking so well." "Mr. Morton," Clara's voice was pleasant but cool, remembering the man's earlier resistance to helping her. "I hope business is good." Very good, very good. That fence project you two completed has folks talking. Smart move, buying the Harrison parcel together." "We thought so," Ethan said mildly, steering Clara away before Morton could fish for more details about their partnership. They wandered through the festival, stopping to examine goods and talk with neighbors. Jack found them near the food vendors, already several drinks into his afternoon, and in an expansive mood. "There's the power couple," he announced loudly enough to turn heads. "Building empires and breaking hearts all over the territory." "Jack, you're drunk," Clara said, but she was smiling. "I'm happy. There's a difference." Jack swayed slightly, then straightened with exaggerated dignity. You two are good together. Everyone can see it. Why can't you? Jack, Ethan started, but the foreman was already moving away, distracted by something shiny at another booth. Clara laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. He's not subtle, is he? Never has been. It's part of his charm. They continued through the festival, and gradually Ethan noticed a pattern. People were watching them, yes, but not with the disapproval he'd half expected. Instead, there was curiosity mixed with something that looked almost like approval. The partnership had changed how the town saw them, not as the boy who'd left and the widow struggling alone, but as something new, something that worked. Richard Calhoun appeared as the afternoon wore on, his presence cutting through the festival atmosphere like a cold wind. He moved through the crowd with his usual arrogance, stopping to talk with town council members and prominent ranchers. When his gaze fell on Ethan and Clara, his expression hardened. Trouble, Clara murmured. I see him. Ethan kept his voice low. We don't have to engage. But Calhoun was already approaching, a false smile plastered on his face. Cole, Mrs. Bennett, enjoying the festivities? We are, Clara said coolly. You? Always. Though I have to say I'm surprised to see you two arrive together. Appearances and all that. Calhoun's tone was pleasant, but the implication was clear. He was suggesting impropriety. We're business partners, Ethan said carefully. And neighbors. It made sense to ride in together. Of course, business partners. Calhoun's smile didn't reach his eyes. Though I wonder how long that arrangement will last. Partnerships are delicate things, especially when personal feelings get involved. One misunderstanding, one disagreement, and everything falls apart. Is there a point to this conversation? Claire's voice had gone cold. Or are you just here to spread insinuations? I'm here to offer friendly advice. You've tied your financial future to Cole's good behavior. That seems risky, given his history of leaving when things get difficult. The words hit their mark, and Ethan felt Clara tense beside him. But before he could respond, she spoke, her voice cutting through the space between them with deadly precision. My choices are my own, Mr. Calhoun, and I don't recall asking for your opinion on them. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have better things to do than listen to you attempt to undermine a partnership that's already proven more successful than anything you've offered. She turned and walked away, head high, leaving both men staring after her. Ethan looked at Calhoun, saw the fury barely contained beneath his polished exterior, and felt a spike of genuine concern. Stay away from her, Ethan said quietly, and stay away from our property. This friendly advice routine isn't fooling anyone. Careful, Cole. You're making enemies you can't afford. So are you. Ethan walked away before the confrontation could escalate, finding Clara near the music stage. Her hands were shaking slightly, and he realized the confrontation had cost her more than she'd shown. You all right? He asked gently. I'm fine. Just angry. Clara took a breath, visibly collecting herself. He's not going to stop, is he? No, but neither are we. She looked at him then, and something in her expression made Ethan's breath catch. It was trust, raw and complete, the kind that could be destroyed in an instant, but took months to build. Dance with me, she said suddenly. What? Dance with me. Right now. Let everyone see that we're not hiding, not ashamed, not intimidated by Richard Calhoun or anyone else. Clara held out her hand. Unless you've forgotten how. Ethan took her hand, his heart pounding. I remember. They moved on to the makeshift dance floor where other couples swayed to the band's music. Clara fit into his arms like she'd never left. And for a moment Ethan was transported back to a town social 10 years earlier when they'd been young and in love and convinced the world was theirs to claim. I missed this, Clara said softly. Dancing with you. I missed everything about you. She looked up at him, and the vulnerability in her eyes was almost too much to bear. Ethan, I need you to know something. I'm scared. Of this? Of us? Of what it means to let myself feel again. But I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of protecting myself from something that might actually be good. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe we're more than just business partners. Maybe we have been for a while. and I've just been too stubborn to admit it. Clara's hands tightened on his shoulders. I'm saying that I think I'm ready to try, if you are. Ethan's world narrowed to her face, her words, the feeling of her in his arms. I've been ready since the day I came back. I've just been waiting for you. Then stop waiting. He kissed her there, in front of the entire town, in the middle of the spring festival with the band playing and children laughing and the whole world watching. It wasn't their first kiss. That had been years ago, desperate and sweet and full of youthful passion. This was different. This was a promise, a commitment, a choice made with full knowledge of what it meant and what it cost. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, Ethan noticed the crowd around them had fallen silent. Then someone started clapping, Jack, predictably, and the applause spread like wildfire. People were grinning, some of the older women dabbing at their eyes, and even stern old Mrs. Patterson looked pleased. Well, Clara said, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright, I suppose that answers any questions about our relationship. Any regrets? Not a single one. They stayed at the festival until evening, no longer hiding behind the pretense of business partnership. Clara's hand stayed in Ethan's, and they accepted congratulations from neighbors who'd been watching their slow reconciliation with interest. It felt like coming home in a way that geography never could, being accepted, being welcomed, being part of something larger than just themselves. As the sun set and the festival began to wind down, they walked back to the wagon together. The streets were emptying, families heading home, but Ethan and Clara were in no hurry. Stay for dinner, Clara said as they reached her wagon. Please, I don't want this day to end yet. I'd like that. They drove back to Clara's ranch in comfortable silence, the early stars beginning to emerge overhead. Miguel and Carlos had already left for town on their own horses, giving them privacy, and the ranch sat quiet in the gathering dusk. Clara made a simple meal while Ethan built up the fire against the evening chill. They ate at her small kitchen table, the same one where they'd signed partnership papers months earlier, where they'd fought and reconciled and slowly rebuilt what had been broken. I need to tell you something, Clara said as they finished eating. About Samuel. About my marriage. Ethan waited, letting her find the words in her own time. I told you I learned to love him, and that was true. But what I didn't say was that I compared him to you constantly. Every kindness, every gesture, every moment, I measured it against what we'd had. It wasn't fair to him, and I knew it, but I couldn't stop. Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. When he died, I felt guilty. Not just grief, but guilt that I'd never given him all of my heart, because part of it was still with you. Clara, let me finish, please. She took a shaky breath. I've spent the last 3 years trying to prove I didn't need anyone, that I could be complete on my own, and I am. But I'm realizing that being complete doesn't mean being alone. It means being whole enough to choose partnership rather than needing it. What are you saying? I'm saying that I choose you, not because I need rescuing or protection or someone to complete me, but because I want you in my life. Because you make me laugh, and you challenge me, and you see me clearly, all of me, even the difficult parts, and you stay anyway. Clara reached across the table and took his hand. I'm saying that I love you, still, again, however you want to describe it. I love you, and I'm ready to build something real with you if you want the same. Ethan felt emotion crash over him like a wave, joy and relief, and a love so profound it was almost painful. I want the same. I've wanted it since the day I came back, maybe since the day I left. He stood and moved around the table, pulling Clara to her feet. I love you. I've loved you for 10 years, even when I was trying not to, even when I thought I'd lost any right to. You're it for me, Clara. You always have been. She kissed him then, deep and sure, and Ethan wrapped his arms around her and held on like she was the only solid thing in a spinning world. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. So what now? Clara asked. Now we build. Together. Whatever that looks like. Ethan brushed a tear from her cheek. Though I should probably court you properly. Take you to dinner, bring you flowers, all the things I didn't do enough of the first time around. We're business partners who own property together and just announced our relationship to the entire town. I think we've moved past traditional courting. Still, you deserve to be courted, to be chosen deliberately and publicly and repeatedly. Ethan smiled. So that's what I'm going to do. Fair warning. I can live with that. They spent the rest of the evening talking, making plans for the ranch and for their future together. It was practical and romantic at once, discussing fall planting schedules and whether they'd combine their operations entirely or maintain separate ranches while living together. Where they'd live, how they'd manage the crews, what their partnership would look like as it evolved from business into something more. As midnight approached, Ethan reluctantly prepared to leave. Propriety still mattered, especially in a small town, and he wanted to do this right. Come back tomorrow? Clara asked at the door. Try to keep me away? He kissed her goodnight, sweet and lingering, then rode home under a sky full of stars. The night air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of spring flowers and new grass, and Ethan felt more alive than he had in years. Jack was waiting on the porch when he arrived, smoking his pipe and looking smug. Took you long enough, the foreman said. We were being careful. You were being idiots. Everyone could see how you felt about each other. Everyone except you two. Jack stood and stretched. I'm glad you finally figured it out. Your father would be pleased. The mention of his father sent a pang through Ethan's chest. I wish he was here to see it. He is, in a way. This is what he wanted, you and Clara building something together, making better choices than he did. Jack knocked ash from his pipe. You gonna marry her? When she's ready. I'm not rushing this. We're going to do it right this time. Good. She deserves that. Jack headed toward the bunkhouse, then paused. Ethan, you did good. Coming back, facing your mistakes, fighting for her. Your father couldn't do that when it mattered. You did. That counts for something. The words settled over Ethan like a benediction. He sat on the porch long after Jack had gone to bed, watching the stars wheel overhead and thinking about choices and consequences and the strange paths that led people home. The next months passed in a blur of work and growing intimacy. Ethan courted Clara with the kind of intentionality he should have shown years earlier, bringing her wildflowers he found on his morning rides, surprising her with books she'd mentioned wanting to read, showing up to help with difficult tasks without being asked. They had dinner together most evenings, alternating between her ranch and his, building a shared life one meal at a time. The physical intimacy grew as well, carefully and with mutual respect. They'd learned patience through their separation, learned that some things were worth waiting for. When Clara finally invited Ethan to stay the night, it was a choice made with clear eyes and full hearts, and the morning after found them tangled together in her bed, happy in a way that felt both new and familiar. Marry me, Ethan said into the quiet dawn. Clara stirred against his chest. What? Marry me. Not today, not next week, but soon. When you're ready. He ran his fingers through her hair, marveling that he had the right to touch her this way. I want to build everything with you. Not just ranches and business partnerships, but a life, a family, a future. Clara was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan's heart pounded as he waited for her response. Yes, she said finally. Yes, I'll marry you, but on one condition. Anything. We do it as equals. Not you saving me, not me needing you, but two people choosing each other because we make each other better. Partners in everything. Partners in everything, Ethan agreed and kissed her to seal the promise. They announced their engagement at Sunday dinner with Jack, Miguel, and Carlos, who celebrated with an enthusiasm that suggested none of them were remotely surprised. Word spread through town with the speed of wildfire, and the congratulations poured in from neighbors and friends who'd been invested in their story from the beginning. Richard Calhoun's response was notably absent, but Ethan and Clara didn't let his silence dampen their happiness. They had each other, they had their land, and they had a future that was finally, blessedly, theirs to build. The wedding was set for late summer, giving them time to prepare and plan. Clara insisted on a simple ceremony, no extravagance, no fuss. Just the people who mattered gathered to witness their commitment. Ethan would have married her in a field with just Jack as witness, but he understood that Clara needed this to be public, needed the community to see them choosing each other freely and without reservation. As summer deepened and the wedding approached, they combined their operations officially, merging herds and crews and creating something larger and more sustainable than either ranch had been separately. It was practical and symbolic at once, two becoming one, building on the foundation they'd established as partners and extending it into every aspect of their lives. The night before the wedding, Clara came to Ethan's ranch, their ranch now, and found him on the porch watching the sunset. "Nervous?" she asked, settling beside him. "Not even a little bit." Ethan took her hand. "You?" Terrified, excited, happy, all of it at once. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "I keep thinking about what we've survived to get here. The separation, the loss, the years of rebuilding. Part of me can't believe we actually made it. We made it because we chose to. Every day, every difficult conversation, every moment when it would have been easier to walk away, we chose to stay and fight for this." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "That's not luck, Clara. That's us being stubborn and brave and unwilling to let the past define our future. I love you," she said simply, "for all of that, for staying when it was hard, for being patient with me while I learned to trust again. I love you too. Always have. Always will." They sat together as the sun disappeared and the stars emerged. Two people who'd found their way back to each other through pain and growth and the kind of love that refused to die despite every reason it should have. Tomorrow they would make it official, would stand before their community and pledge themselves to each other with full knowledge of what that meant. But tonight, this moment, was just theirs. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of late summer day that seemed designed specifically for new beginnings. Ethan woke early in the house that had been his father's and was now his own, though not for much longer. After today, he and Clara would live in her house, their house, which they'd spent the past month expanding to accommodate their combined life. The addition wasn't finished yet, but the core structure was solid, and they'd decided that building their home together, literally and figuratively, was more important than waiting for perfection. Jack found him on the porch an hour before the ceremony, dressed in his best suit and looking more nervous than Ethan had ever seen him. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," Jack observed. "Just thinking." Ethan adjusted his collar for the third time. "About my father, wishing he could be here for this. He is here. In the choices you're making, in the life you're building. That's legacy, not land or money, but the patterns we break and the ones we keep." Jack clapped him on the shoulder. "Robert made mistakes, but he tried to fix them at the end. You're doing the same, only you got the chance to make it right while you're still breathing. That's more than most men get." They rode to Clara's ranch together, Jack driving the wagon with Ethan beside him. The property had been transformed for the occasion, simple but beautiful, with wildflowers gathered in mason jars and chairs set up in neat rows facing the creek where Ethan and Clara had first reconnected months ago. It was fitting, Ethan thought, to marry her in the place where they'd begun rebuilding their foundation. Miguel and Carlos had outdone themselves, stringing lanterns for later and building a makeshift platform for the ceremony. Neighbors arrived in steady streams, ranchers and shopkeepers and families who'd known both Ethan and Clara since childhood. Even stern Mrs. Patterson appeared dressed in her Sunday best and carrying a cake that probably weighed more than she did. Thomas Wickham, the lawyer, would be officiating. It was unusual, but the circuit preacher wouldn't arrive for another month, and neither Ethan nor Clara wanted to wait. Besides, Wickham had been present for every legal milestone in their relationship. The reading of Robert Cole's will, the partnership agreement, the Harrison parcel purchase. It seemed appropriate that he'd be the one to legally bind them in marriage as well. Ethan stood by the creek with Jack beside him as best man, watching guests arrive and trying to calm the butterflies in his stomach. He wasn't nervous about marrying Clara. That was the surest thing in his life. But the public nature of it, the finality of standing before their entire community and claiming each other, carried a weight that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Then he saw her. Clara appeared from her house wearing a simple cream-colored dress that somehow made her look more beautiful than any elaborate gown could have. Her hair was down, falling in dark waves over her shoulders, and she carried a bouquet of the same wildflowers that decorated the ceremony space. She walked toward him alone. No father to give her away. No need for that particular tradition. She was giving herself, making this choice of her own free will, and the independence of it made Ethan's throat tight. Their eyes met, and Clara smiled with such pure joy that Ethan felt something break open in his chest. This was real. After everything, the separation, the pain, the years of penance and rebuilding, they'd arrived at this moment, together. Clara reached him and took his hands, and Wickham began the ceremony with words about partnership and commitment and the choice to build a life together. Ethan heard it all through a haze of emotion, his focus entirely on Clara's face, on the way her hands trembled slightly in his, on the tears shining in her eyes that matched his own. When it came time for vows, Clara spoke first, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying every word. Ethan, when you left 6 years ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd never trust again, never love again, never risk my heart on something as uncertain as another person's promises. But you came back. And more than that, you stayed. You stayed through my anger and my fear and my walls. You stayed when I pushed you away and when I tested you and when I gave you every reason to leave again. You stayed, and you proved that sometimes people do change. Sometimes they grow into who they were meant to be all along. She paused, collecting herself, and Ethan squeezed her hands gently. You see me clearly, all of me, not just the parts that are easy to love. You respect my independence while offering partnership. You challenge me while supporting me. You make me laugh, and you make me think, and you make me brave enough to risk everything on the belief that this time we'll get it right. I love you for all of that, and I promise to be your partner in everything, in joy and hardship, in success and failure, in building a life that's ours together. I promise to choose you every day for the rest of our lives. Ethan had to clear his throat twice before he could speak, and even then his voice was rough with emotion. Clara, I don't deserve you. I know that. I knew it when I left, and I know it now, but you're giving me the chance anyway, and I promise not to waste it. I promise to stay, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I promise to be honest, even when the truth is uncomfortable. I promise to respect your strength while offering mine. I promise to build with you, not for you. To stand beside you, not in front of you. He took a shaky breath, aware of every eye on them, but seeing only Clara. You asked me once what I wanted from you, and I didn't have a good answer. But I do now. I want a lifetime of mornings waking up beside you. I want to build something that matters, not just a ranch or a business, but a family, a legacy, a love that other people look at and believe in. I want to be the man you deserve, and I promise to spend every day of the rest of my life trying to become him. I love you. I've loved you since I was 22 years old, and I'll love you until the day I die. That's my vow. Wickham pronounced them married with a smile that suggested he was as emotionally invested in their story as everyone else present. You may kiss your bride. Ethan pulled Clara close and kissed her to the sound of applause and cheers, and in that moment, everything else fell away. The past no longer mattered. The future was uncertain. But this, Clara in his arms, their community witnessing their choice, the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, this was everything. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Tables had been set up near the house, loaded with food that neighbors had contributed. Music came from a fiddle player who'd known both Ethan and Clara since childhood, and couples took turns dancing while children ran wild and adults talked and laughed and celebrated the union that half the town had been betting on for months. Jack got progressively drunker and more sentimental, at one point pulling both Ethan and Clara into a crushing hug and declaring them the best thing that ever happened to this godforsaken valley. Miguel and Carlos presented them with a hand-carved wooden sign for their combined ranch, Cole and Bennett, that they'd been secretly working on for weeks. Mrs. Patterson cried openly, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and telling anyone who would listen that she'd known those two would end up together since they were teenagers. The only notable absence was Richard Calhoun, whose lack of appearance felt more like a blessing than an insult. His shadow had hung over their relationship long enough. Today was about celebration, not confrontation. As the sun began to set and the lanterns Miguel and Carlos had hung began to glow, Ethan and Clara slipped away from the party, walking down to the creek where they'd stood for the ceremony. The sounds of celebration continued behind them, but here by the water they had a moment of privacy. Mrs. Cole, Ethan said, testing the name. How does that sound? Strange, Good strange. Clara leaned into his side. Though I'm keeping Bennett for the ranch. Colin Bennett has a nice ring to it. Perfect ring to it. Ethan wrapped his arm around her waist. Thank you. For what? For giving me another chance. For believing I could be better than I was. For building this with me. Clara turned in his arms, her face serious despite the joy of the day. Ethan, you need to understand something. I didn't give you another chance because I was being generous or forgiving. I gave you another chance because I saw you earn it. Every day, every choice, every moment you could have run and didn't. You proved yourself. That's not me being charitable, that's you being worthy. The words settled into Ethan's chest like a physical warmth. For 6 years he'd carried the weight of his mistake, the shame of having left when he should have stayed. But Clara was right. He'd earned his way back. Not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through consistent, daily choice to be better than he'd been. I love you, he said simply, because sometimes the most profound truths were the simplest ones. I love you too. Clara smiled. Now come on, we have a party to get back to, and I want to dance with my husband. They returned to the celebration hand in hand and danced until the stars came out and the lanterns burned low and the guests began to drift home with full bellies and happy hearts. Jack was the last to leave, swaying slightly as he climbed into his wagon, but looking more content than Ethan had ever seen him. You did good, boy, Jack said, his words only slightly slurred. Real good. Your father would be proud. Then it was just Ethan and Clara standing in the yard of their combined ranch as the last sounds of celebration faded into the night. They cleaned up together, working in comfortable silence, before finally retreating to the house they would now share. The bedroom had been Clara's, but was now theirs, and they came together with the kind of tenderness and passion that came from truly knowing each other. Not just bodies, but hearts. Not just desire, but love that had been tested and proven resilient. Afterward, they lay tangled together, and Ethan felt a peace he'd never known was possible. What are you thinking? Clara asked sleepily. That I'm home. Finally, completely home. Good. Because you're not allowed to leave anymore. Wouldn't dream of it. The months that followed established the rhythm of their married life. They combined their operations fully, creating a ranch that was more efficient and profitable than either had been separately. The additional acreage from the Harrison parcel gave them room to expand the herd, and Clara's mechanical expertise combined with Ethan's understanding of breeding and grazing rotation resulted in an operation that became the model for other ranchers in the territory. But it wasn't just about the work. It was about the small intimacies of shared life. Morning coffee, drunk on the porch, while watching the sunrise, evening meals where they reviewed the day's work and made plans for tomorrow, nights spent reading together or simply talking until sleep claimed them. It was about learning each other's rhythms, adjusting to each other's habits, building a life that felt both entirely new and comfortably familiar. Winter came again, harsh but manageable now that they had combined resources. When a particularly brutal storm hit in January, threatening livestock and testing their preparation, they worked together with their crews to ensure everything survived. The old Ethan would have tried to handle it alone, would have seen asking for help as weakness. But this Ethan understood that strength wasn't about individual capability. It was about knowing when to rely on others, when to accept support, when to admit that some burdens were lighter when shared. It was during that winter, as February's cold settled over the valley, that Clara told him she was pregnant. They were in the kitchen, Clara making breakfast while Ethan reviewed supply orders. When she said it, casually, as if she were commenting on the weather rather than changing everything. I'm pregnant. Ethan looked up sharply. What? Pregnant, with child. Expecting. Clara set down the pan she'd been holding, her hands trembling slightly. I wanted to be sure before I told you. The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday when you were meeting with the cattle buyer. Ethan stood so quickly his chair fell over. He crossed to Clara in 3 strides, taking her hands in his and searching her face. Are you all right? How do you feel when... I'm fine. Perfectly healthy. Due in late summer, probably August. Clara smiled, though he could see nervousness beneath it. Are you happy? Because you look terrified. Ethan stopped, trying to identify the tornado of emotions spinning through him. Fear, yes, but also joy so profound it was almost painful. Hope, wonder, the bone-deep certainty that this was right, that they were ready. I'm everything, happy and scared and so in love with you I can barely breathe. Clara's nervousness eased and she laughed. That's a lot of emotions for before breakfast. Are you happy? Terrified, Clara admitted. But yes, happy. This is what we wanted, right? A family? It is. Ethan pulled her close, careful of her as if she were made of glass, even though he knew she was stronger than that. We're going to be parents. The reality of it settled over them gradually. The implications, the changes, the need to adjust their plans to account for this new life they were bringing into the world. But mostly, they felt joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy at the prospect of creating something together that was more than land or livestock or business partnerships. Ethan told Jack that evening, and the foreman's response was to get quietly drunk while muttering about damn fool kids growing up and having kids of their own. But his eyes were suspiciously bright, and the next day he started building a cradle in the workshop without being asked. Word spread through the community with the usual speed, and congratulations poured in. Women who'd been through childbirth offered advice, some helpful, some terrifying, and men clapped Ethan on the shoulder with knowing looks that suggested he was in for an adventure. Even Mrs. Patterson appeared with baby clothes she'd been saving, her stern expression softening as she handed them to Clara with rare tenderness. The only sour note came from Richard Calhoun, who they encountered in town during Clara's 4th month. She was beginning to show, her body changing in ways that made the pregnancy undeniable, and Calhoun's gaze lingered on her stomach with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. "Congratulations," Calhoun said, his tone carefully neutral. "I hear you're expecting." "We are," Clara said coolly. "Thank you. Quite the development. Of course, running a ranch while pregnant and then with an infant will be challenging. If you find you need to sell..." "We won't." Ethan's voice was flat, brooking no argument. "Clara's not doing this alone. We have crews, we have resources, and we have each other. The ranch will be fine." Calhoun's smile was thin. "Of course, I'm sure you'll manage. Though the offer stands if circumstances change. I'd be happy to take the property off your hands at a fair price." "The property is not for sale," Clara said firmly. "It will never be for sale. It's our child's inheritance, Mr. Calhoun. We're building something to pass down. That's not going to change because I'm pregnant." Something flickered in Calhoun's expression, frustration or anger, or perhaps just the recognition that he'd finally completely lost. He'd spent years trying to acquire Clara's land, and now it was permanently out of reach, tied to Ethan's property and their growing family in ways that made separation impossible. "I see," Calhoun said finally. "Then I wish you well." He walked away, and Ethan felt Clara's hand tighten on his arm. "He's not going to stop, is he?" she asked quietly. "Maybe not, but it doesn't matter. We're stronger than he is. Together, we're untouchable." Clara nodded, though worry lingered in her eyes. They finished their shopping and returned home, and Ethan made a mental note to be more vigilant about security, about watching for signs that Calhoun might try something more aggressive than business offers and social pressure. But the months passed peacefully. Spring arrived with its usual rush of green and new life, and they prepared for the baby with the same careful attention they gave to everything else. The addition to the house was completed, creating more space for the nursery and future children. Clara continued working through her pregnancy, stubborn and determined despite Ethan's concerns, though she did accept help more readily as the months progressed. It was in late July, 3 weeks before the baby was due, that the confrontation they'd been half expecting finally arrived. Ethan was in the far pasture checking fence lines when Miguel came racing up on horseback, his expression urgent. "Senor Ethan, come quick! Calhoun's men are at the house!" Ethan didn't ask questions. He spurred his horse into a gallop, covering the distance to the ranch house in minutes that felt like hours. His heart pounded with a fear that was new and terrifying, not for himself but for Clara, for the baby, for everything they'd built. He arrived to find 3 of Calhoun's men in the yard, and Clara standing on the porch with a rifle in her hands. Her face was pale but determined, and Ethan recognized the stance she'd taken, feet planted, weapon ready, prepared to defend what was hers. "What's going on here?" Ethan dismounted quickly, moving to stand beside Clara. One of Calhoun's men, a lean cowboy named Stevens, held up his hands in a gesture meant to be placating. "No trouble, Cole. Mr. Calhoun sent us to discuss a water rights issue. Seems the creek's running low and he's concerned about fair distribution." "The creek's fine," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tension vibrating through her. "We had this conversation last month. The distribution schedule is posted at the boundary marker. Your boss is just trying to cause problems. Now, Mrs. Cole, there's no need to be hostile. It's hostile to show up at someone's home uninvited with 3 armed men," Ethan cut in, his voice dangerously quiet. "You want to discuss water rights? You make an appointment like civilized people. You don't show up like you're planning a raid." Stephen's expression hardened. "Mr. Calhoun is within his rights to what? Intimidate a pregnant woman? Threaten my property?" Ethan took a step forward, and something in his demeanor made all 3 men shift uncomfortably. "You tell Calhoun that if he has issues, he can take them up with me directly. And he can do it in town, in public, where witnesses can verify what's actually said. Because this, showing up at my home, approaching my wife, this ends now." There was a long moment of tense silence, and Ethan was acutely aware of Clara beside him, of the danger she was in simply by being present, of how quickly this situation could turn violent if someone made the wrong move. Finally, Stevens nodded slowly. "We'll relay your message." "You do that." The 3 men mounted and rode off, and only when they were out of sight did Clara lower the rifle. Her hands were shaking, and Ethan gently took the weapon from her before pulling her into his arms. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently. "Did they hurt you?" "I'm fine. They just showed up, started making demands about inspecting the creek boundary. I told them to leave. They refused, so I got the rifle." Clara's voice was muffled against his chest. "Ethan, this is escalating. He's not just making business offers anymore." "I know." Ethan held her tighter, feeling the swell of her belly between them where their child grew. "This ends now. I'm going to town, I'm talking to the sheriff, and I'm making it clear that Calhoun crossed a line." "What if that makes it worse?" "It can't get worse than armed men showing up at our home while I'm gone. Clara, he's counting on us being isolated, on no one caring enough to get involved. But we have allies, neighbors, friends, people who respect what we've built. It's time to use that." They spent the rest of the day documenting everything: the men who'd appeared, what was said, the timeline of Calhoun's harassment over the years. Jack and the crews were called in and told to be vigilant. Miguel volunteered to stay at the house nights, sleeping in the barn with a loaded rifle until the situation resolved. The next morning, Ethan rode into town with a determination that bordered on fury. He found Sheriff Hayes in his office, an older man who'd kept the peace in the territory for 15 years and had the weathered look of someone who'd seen it all. "I need to file a complaint," Ethan said without preamble, "about Richard Calhoun and his harassment of my wife and property." Hayes listened as Ethan laid out the history, the persistent purchase offers, the social pressure, the subtle threats, and finally yesterday's incident with armed men appearing at the ranch. When Ethan finished, the sheriff sat back in his chair with a heavy sigh. "Cole, I'm going to be straight with you. Calhoun's a powerful man. He has friends on the territorial council, business interests that employ half the county. Going after him means going after someone who can make life very difficult. Are you saying you won't help?" "I'm saying it's complicated." Hayes pulled out a form. "But I will file the complaint. And I will talk to Calhoun, make it clear that armed trespass is not acceptable regardless of who's doing it. What happens after that? Well, that depends on whether he's smart enough to back off." It wasn't as much as Ethan wanted, but it was something. He filed the formal complaint, got a copy for his records, and left feeling slightly less helpless than he'd arrived. On his way out of town, he ran into Thomas Wickham, who'd heard about the incident through the town's efficient gossip network. "Ethan, a word?" Wickham gestured to his office. "I may have some information relevant to your situation with Calhoun." They went inside and Wickham pulled out a thick file. "I've been doing some research, purely out of professional curiosity, you understand, into Calhoun's business dealings, and I've discovered some irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that suggest he's not quite as solvent as he appears. He's over-leveraged, borrowed heavily to acquire land, and he's counting on certain deals going through to cover his debts. deals that involve eventually acquiring your combined property at below market rates. Wickham adjusted his spectacles. If those deals don't materialize, if you continue to hold your land and operate successfully, he faces potential financial ruin. Ethan processed this. So all of this, the harassment, the pressure, the escalation, it's not just about wanting our land. He needs it. Precisely. Which makes him dangerous because desperate men do desperate things. But it also means he has vulnerabilities. Wickham leaned forward. I'm not suggesting anything illegal, you understand. But information is power. If Calhoun knew that you knew about his financial situation, he might reconsider his approach. It was delicate, potentially dangerous, but it gave Ethan something he hadn't had before: leverage. He thanked Wickham and rode home, his mind working through possibilities. That evening, he and Clara sat on their porch and talked through their options. They could continue as they had been, hoping Calhoun would eventually give up. They could escalate, using Wickham's information to pressure him into backing off. Or they could try to find a middle ground, some way to resolve the situation that didn't destroy anyone, but established clear boundaries. I don't want to ruin him, Clara said thoughtfully. Despite everything, I don't want to be the cause of someone losing everything. That's not who I am. Even though he's been trying to do exactly that to you for years? Even then, Clara took Ethan's hand. But I also won't let him continue threatening our family. So we find a way to make him stop that doesn't require destroying him. We're better than that. Ethan marveled at her, at the strength that chose compassion, even in the face of harassment. All right, then we try talking to him, one more time, in public, with witnesses. We lay out what we know and what we're willing to do, which is leave him alone if he leaves us alone. His financial situation is his problem to solve, not ours, but our family's safety is non-negotiable. It took 3 days to arrange the meeting. Sheriff Hayes agreed to be present, along with several prominent ranchers, including Jack and 2 members of the town council. They met in the town hall, in a room that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and Calhoun arrived looking confident right up until he saw the assembly waiting for him. "What is this?" he demanded. "A conversation," Ethan said calmly, "about ending a conflict that's gone on too long." They talked for 2 hours. Ethan laid out the history of harassment without embellishment or exaggeration, supported by documentation and witness statements. He presented the sheriff's report about the armed trespass, and then, carefully and without gloating, he mentioned that he was aware of Calhoun's financial difficulties, and that he understood how pressure could make people act in ways they normally wouldn't. "I'm not interested in ruining you," Ethan said. "I'm not interested in exposing your business problems or making your life difficult. I just want you to leave my family alone, leave Clara alone, leave our property alone, and move on. Find another solution to your financial situation that doesn't involve harassing us." Calhoun's face had gone red, then white, cycling through emotions as he realized how thoroughly his situation had been exposed. "You have no right. I have every right to protect my family," Ethan interrupted. "And so does everyone in this room. That's what community means. We look out for each other." One of the ranchers, an old-timer named Johnson who'd been neutral until now, spoke up. "Dick, you've been pushing too hard for too long. The Cole Bennett operation is sound. They're not going to fail just because you want them to. You need to accept that and find another way forward." The town council members nodded agreement, and even Sheriff Hayes looked stern. The message was clear. Calhoun had lost not just this particular battle, but the support of the community he'd counted on to turn a blind eye to his methods. "Fine," Calhoun said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "I'll leave them alone. But don't come asking for help when you need it." "We won't," Clara said quietly. She'd been silent through most of the meeting, letting Ethan handle the confrontation, but now she spoke with calm authority. "Mr. Calhoun, I genuinely hope you find a way through your difficulties, but it won't be at our expense. Not anymore." The meeting ended with a formal agreement, witnessed and documented, that Calhoun would cease all harassment and maintain clear boundaries. It wasn't a perfect resolution. The tension would linger. The history couldn't be erased. But it was closure of a sort. As they left the town hall, Clara took Ethan's arm, her pregnancy making her movement slower but no less purposeful. "We did it," she said wonderingly. We actually ended it. We did. Together. Ethan helped her into the wagon. Though I give most of the credit to you, choosing compassion when you could have chosen revenge, that takes real strength. Or maybe just exhaustion. I'm too tired and too pregnant to carry grudges. Clara smiled. I just want to focus on our family now, on building something positive rather than fighting something negative. 3 weeks later, on a warm August evening, as the sun painted the valley in shades of gold, Clara went into labor. Ethan had thought he was prepared. They'd made plans, arranged for the doctor, ensured everything was ready, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for the reality of watching Clara in pain, of feeling helpless as she labored to bring their child into the world. The doctor arrived with his usual efficiency, and the midwife who'd delivered half the babies in the territory took control with practiced calm. They banished Ethan to the kitchen where Jack sat with him, drinking whiskey and telling stories to distract from the sounds coming from the bedroom. First baby's always the hardest, Jack said. But Clara's strong. She'll be fine. You don't know that. I know she survived losing you, survived losing Samuel, survived building a ranch from nothing while every man in the territory told her she couldn't. She can survive this. Jack poured another drink. Have some faith, boy. It was nearly dawn when the cry came, thin and outraged, and the most beautiful sound Ethan had ever heard. He was on his feet and moving before conscious thought, bursting into the bedroom to find Clara exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in cloth. It's a girl, she said, her voice hoarse but joyful. We have a daughter. Ethan approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at the small red face of his child. She was perfect, impossibly tiny, impossibly real, impossibly his. Can I hold her? He asked. Clara handed over the baby with careful guidance, and Ethan cradled his daughter with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred things. She weighed nothing and everything. She was fragile and fierce. She was hope and possibility, and the future made manifest. What should we name her? Clara asked. They discussed names for months, running through family names and meaningful choices, never quite settling on the right one. But looking at his daughter now, Ethan knew. Grace, he said. For the grace we were given. The second chance we didn't earn but got anyway. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Grace Bennett Cole, it's perfect. Grace opened her eyes then, dark blue like all newborns, but with a hint of Clara's shape. And Ethan fell in love for the third time in his life. First with Clara at 16, then with the woman she'd become, and now with this tiny person who represented everything they'd fought for and everything they'd built together. The months that followed were chaotic and exhausting, and more joyful than Ethan had imagined possible. Grace was demanding in the way all infants were, requiring constant attention and care. But watching Clara with their daughter, seeing the gentle competence with which she handled motherhood, Ethan fell in love with her all over again. They settled into the rhythms of parenthood while maintaining the ranch. It required adjustment and compromise, and more help than they'd anticipated. Jack proved surprisingly adept with babies, and Miguel's wife Maria came several times a week to help with household tasks and give Clara breaks to sleep or work. The community rallied in the way small communities did, bringing meals and baby clothes and endless advice. By the time Grace was 6 months old, crawling and babbling and developing a personality that was equal parts Clara's determination and Ethan's quiet strength, they'd found their balance. The ranch operated smoothly under their combined management. The partnership they'd built proved resilient enough to weather the stress of new parenthood, and the love between them, tested by time and distance and pain, had grown into something deeper and more enduring than the passionate romance of their youth. It was on a cold February morning, almost exactly a year after Clara had told him she was pregnant, that Ethan woke to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? He asked sleepily. I was just thinking about how different everything is from a year ago, from 2 years ago, when you first came back. Clara reached out to trace his jaw with her fingers. We've built something remarkable, haven't we? We have. Ethan caught her hand and kissed her palm. Though mostly you built it, I just helped. That's not true. This is ours. Equal parts, equal work, equal everything. Clara paused. I never thanked you properly for coming back, for fighting for us when it would have been easier to stay away. You don't have to thank me for choosing what I wanted most. Maybe not. But I want you to know that I see it. I see all the ways you've changed, all the ways you've proven yourself. You're not the boy who left anymore. You're the man I always believed you could be." The words settled into Ethan's chest like a benediction, healing wounds he'd carried for years. He pulled Clara close, careful not to disturb Grace sleeping in the cradle beside their bed, and held his family with the kind of gratitude that defied words. They'd come so far from that first confrontation by the creek, from the anger and pain and broken trust. They'd rebuilt something beautiful from the ruins of what could have been. And now, watching the sun rise through the bedroom window, Ethan understood that this was what his father had wanted for him. Not the ranch or the land or even the reconciliation with Clara specifically, but this, the peace that came from making better choices, from learning from mistakes, from choosing love even when it was terrifying. The seasons cycled on. Grace grew, taking her first steps as spring arrived again, speaking her first words as summer bloomed. They talked about having more children, expanding their family as they'd expanded their ranch. Clara's operation, their operation, became one of the most successful in the territory, and other ranchers began seeking their advice on breeding programs and land management. Richard Calhoun eventually sold his holdings and moved east, his financial problems finally catching up with him. Ethan and Clara bought several of his parcels, further consolidating their position and ensuring their children's future security. It felt like justice and mercy at once, Calhoun's failure becoming the foundation for their continued success, but without the vindictiveness that could have marked the transaction. On their second anniversary, Ethan took Clara back to the creek where they'd been married, leaving Grace with Maria for the evening. They walked the boundary that had once separated their properties and now united them, watching the water flow and remembering all the conversations that had happened in this space. "I love you," Ethan said, the words as true now as they'd been 2 years ago, 10 years ago, for as long as he'd been capable of the emotion. "Thank you for taking me back, for giving me the chance to be better." "Thank you for taking it," Clara replied, "for becoming someone worth coming back to." They stood together as the sun set, two people who'd survived separation and loss and the weight of their own mistakes. They'd built something from ashes, not just a ranch or a marriage, but a life that mattered, a legacy that would outlast them, passed down to Grace and whatever other children they were blessed with. Ethan came home to settle his father's land and found the widow who'd once stolen his heart. But that wasn't the whole story. The whole story was that he came home broken and left whole, that he found not just Clara, but himself, that together they built something that transformed both of them into people they'd never imagined they could become. The past no longer controlled them. It had shaped them, taught them, made them stronger and wiser and more careful with the gift of love. But it didn't define them. What defined them was this: the choice to stay, to build, to love, with full knowledge of what it cost and unwavering commitment to pay the price. As they walked back to the house where their daughter waited and their future beckoned, Ethan understood that this was grace indeed. Not the absence of mistakes or pain, but the opportunity to rise above them, to become more than the sum of their failures, to come home, truly, finally, completely home, to the only place that had ever mattered, to each other.